Under the amber skies of Durango, Colorado, battle-worn soldier Mason Reed thought he was buying nothing more than an abandoned ranch for $10, a quiet place to disappear. But when he opened the creaking door, the air wasn't empty. On the back porch, a young bobcat crouched in the fading light, its golden eyes locked on his, one paw resting on a torn scrap of wool. It didn't run, it didn't snarl. It looked at him like it had been waiting for him and for a truth that would change both their lives forever. The wind in late autumn carried the scent of dry grass and cold stone across the valley of Durango, Colorado. The mountains stood in quiet watch, their peaks brushed with the first snow of the season. Mason Reed drove alone down the cracked county road, his old Ford truck rattling over potholes. At 36, his face bore the deep lines of someone who had seen too many winters in foreign deserts. Broad-shouldered but lean, his left knee still stiff from a roadside blast 3 years ago. He carried himself with the kind of stillness soldiers keep long after the war is over. The townsfolk he passed didn't know him. He had left Durango 16 years earlier with a duffel bag and a promise to return. Life and loss had changed the man who came back. His hair, once dark brown and thick, was now cropped close to his skull, streaked with premature gray at the temples. The scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline was still pink, newer than the others. His eyes, hazel and alert, constantly scanned his surroundings, an unconscious habit from years of watching for threats in Kandahar and Helmand. He had not planned to buy land that day. The roadside real estate office was small, its sign faded. Inside, an elderly agent named Walter Graves sat behind a desk piled with yellowed files. Walter was wiry with silver hair combed straight back and the quiet look of a man who had spent decades watching people take land and leave it again. "Reed," Walter said, recognizing him immediately, though they hadn't seen each other since Mason was a teenager. "Heard you were back." "News travels fast," Mason replied, his voice rougher than it once had been. "Small town," Walter shrugged. "You looking to settle?" "Just passing through." The lie came easily. Mason hadn't decided yet what he was doing in Durango, only that something had pulled him back after his final tour. Walter studied him for a moment, then slid a single folder toward him. "You might want to look at this." Mason frowned at the title on the file. 82 acres, Morgan Ranch. Inside, the price was typed in bold. $10. $10, Mason asked. "That's not even the tax on a coffee in this town." Walter only shrugged. "Owner wants it gone, no questions asked. You sign, it's yours." Mason studied the paper a moment longer. Questions hovered in his mind. Why so cheap? Why so sudden? But he found himself signing anyway. Maybe it was the weight of silence in his life that made him want a place where no one else wanted to go. The drive out to the ranch took him past miles of scorched pasture. The earth was brittle under the wind, dotted with stubborn weeds. At the end of an overgrown dirt track, the house came into view. A 3-room wooden structure leaning slightly to one side, roof patched with moss, porch sagging on rusted nails. The front door hung askew on its hinges. It looked like the kind of place that had stopped breathing years ago. Mason killed the engine and stepped out. His boots sank into the soft earth. The air was cold enough to bite, but it carried the faint smell of ash, or fresh, not the stale kind of a long-dead fire. He moved up the creaking steps and pressed a palm to the door. The wood was warped but warm from the afternoon sun. For a moment, a flash of memory, another door, another country, the weight of his rifle as he signaled to his unit to prepare for entry. He pushed the thought away and focused on the present. This wasn't a combat zone. This was Durango. This was home, or at least it had been once. Inside, the light was thin and dusty. A glass of water sat on the table, a few drops still clinging to its rim. In the corner, the stone fireplace held a mound of ash that radiated faint heat. Someone had been here not long ago. Mason's instincts sharpened. He scanned the room, his hand unconsciously brushing the pocket knife clipped to his belt. The floorboards groaned under his weight as he crossed into the kitchen. The back door stood slightly open, swaying with the wind. Beyond it lay a narrow porch looking out over the untamed backyard. That was when he saw it. A small bobcat crouched on the top step, its fur a mottled blend of silver gray and tawny gold. The animal's body was tense but not trembling, muscles coiled like a spring. golden brown eyes fixed on him with unblinking focus, half warning, half question. In its paws, it held not prey but a frayed scrap of wool, its edges torn and dirty, as though it had been carried for a long time. Mason froze, reading the scene like a battlefield. The bobcat didn't growl. It didn't back away. Instead, it lowered the scrap to its paws and simply stared. The soldier took a slow breath, crouched down just enough to meet its gaze without towering over it. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of the wind and the quiet crackle of a dying ember inside. He noticed then that the animal's coat was in good condition despite the cold. Someone had cared for it once. Its right ear bore a faint notch, likely from an old scrape. Mason eased a step closer, his voice low and steady. "What's your story, huh?" The bobcat's ears flicked forward at the sound. It remained still, but its eyes didn't leave his. Mason spotted something glinting at its neck, a small, tarnished tag. He didn't dare reach for it yet. Then he noticed the wool scrap. Something was embroidered on it, faded blue thread forming letters. He leaned slightly forward, careful not to startle the animal. The thread spelled a name. His name. Mason. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air ran through him. This wasn't coincidence. This was something else entirely. From behind him, a voice called softly, startling him enough to shift his weight. An elderly woman stood at the side of the porch, hands tucked into a thick knitted shawl. Her face was sun-worn, framed by loose strands of white hair. "You've met Luna," she said. "She's been here longer than the weeds." Mason straightened. "You're the neighbor?" She nodded. "Eleanor Parker. Lived on the next plot over for 40 years. Her eyes flickered toward the bobcat. "I used to bring scraps when I could, but—" Her eyes flickered toward the road. Not everyone wanted her here. The bobcat, Luna, glanced briefly at Eleanor before looking back at Mason, as if weighing both of them. "What happened to the last owner?" Mason asked. Eleanor sighed, the sound brittle in the chill air. "Young woman named Hannah Morgan. Got sick, bad sick. She kept the bobcat since it was just a kit. Raised it here." Her eyes darkened. "When she passed, a woman named Victoria Stone stepped in. Said she'd take care of Luna. But one day Victoria was just gone. Left her here. No feed, no shelter except what's left of this house." Mason looked again at the animal. The wind tugged at its fur, but it stayed put, a sentinel on the step. There was something in its gaze he couldn't shake, an unspoken plea, the same one he had seen in the eyes of stray children in war zones. "I'll keep her," Mason said quietly. Eleanor's brows lifted. "You don't even know what she's been through." "I know enough," he replied, his voice firm. He set his pack down, pulled out a canteen, and poured a small puddle of water into a shallow dent in the porch's wood. Luna approached, head low, and began to lap at it. When she finished, she didn't run. She simply sat, tail curling around her paws, and kept watching him. The last light of the day spilled across the fields as Mason leaned against the porch rail, the cold seeping through his jacket. The mountains beyond Durango stood in shadow, the air thick with the smell of coming snow. Somewhere between the moment he stepped onto that porch and the bobcat lowering its head to drink, something had shifted. The ranch wasn't just a place to disappear anymore. It had become a place where someone or something was waiting. "Why does she have my name?" Mason asked, nodding toward the wool scrap. Eleanor's expression changed, surprise giving way to something more calculating. "I don't know anything about that," she said, but her eyes told a different story. "Best ask Hannah's cousin if you want to know more. Ryan Morgan. He comes by the cemetery sometimes." Before Mason could press further, Eleanor retreated down the steps. "I'll bring some food tomorrow," she called over her shoulder, "for both of you." The next morning, the frost lay thick across the Durango fields, turning each blade of grass into a tiny spear of glass. Mason stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, the scent of bitter roast cutting through the cold. Luna was already there, curled into a tight ball on the top step, her breath puffing faint clouds in the crisp air. When his boots creaked on the boards, her eyes flicked open, sharp and gold. She didn't run. Mason set his coffee on the rail, crouched, and placed a small plate on the porch. Thin strips of dried venison he had kept in his pack since the road trip home. The meat scent drifted in the cold. Luna's ears tilted forward, She didn't move at first, only studied him with that silent calculation wild things have. Mason leaned back against the railing, keeping his hands visible. Finally, she stepped forward, muscles rippling under her coat. Around her neck, he saw the dull glint of a small silver tag, its surface worn smooth in some places, but still legible. Luna. The name seemed to suit her. Solid, untamed, as much a part of the mountains as the snow and the pines. Mason spoke it aloud once, low and steady. The bobcat paused mid-step, her head tilting slightly as if she recognized the sound. When she finished eating, Luna retreated to the corner of the porch, curling back into herself, but never taking her eyes off him. Mason gathered his mug and went inside. The air in the kitchen was stale, touched with the faint scent of smoke and damp wood. Morning light revealed more than he had noticed the day before. Dusty shelves lined with mason jars, a cracked porcelain sink, and near the far wall, a small space that had been cleared deliberately. A thin blanket lay folded there, frayed at the edges, with a couple of old books stacked beside it. Mason picked one up. The cover was faded, but the title read, Wildlife of the San Juan Range. Inside the front cover, written in looping penmanship, was a name, Hannah Morgan. He set the book down and reached for a bundle of papers tied with rough twine. The first page was a rescue intake form from the Colorado Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. It detailed Luna's early life, a bobcat kit found alone in the high country, dehydrated and underweight. Rescuer, Hannah Morgan. Age at intake, 4 weeks. Intended release pending based on health and behavior. The stack contained more notes, feeding schedules, vet visits, behavior logs. Mason skimmed them, each detail building a picture of a young woman determined to keep the bobcat alive. But there was nothing after the 3rd year. No transfer forms, no release documentation. It was as if the official record had stopped, leaving only Luna and an empty house. A knock on the front door broke his thoughts. When Mason opened it, Eleanor Parker stood there holding a basket covered with a tea towel. She was wrapped in a long brown coat, her silver hair braided down her back. Her face was weathered, but her eyes were clear and direct. "Thought you could use breakfast," she said, stepping inside with her waiting for an invitation. She set the basket on the table, revealing warm cornbread, a jar of blackberry jam, and a small thermos. Mason poured her coffee while she looked around the kitchen. "Hasn't changed much," she murmured. "Hannah kept it tidy even when she was sick." He sat across from her. "You knew her well." Eleanor's gaze softened. Well enough to know she had more heart than most folks twice her age. She took Luna in when everyone else said to let nature take its course, wouldn't hear of putting her down. She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug. Then the sickness came on fast. She kept to herself, didn't tell many people how bad it was. "And Victoria Stone?" Mason asked. At the name, Eleanor's lips thinned. Tall woman, sharp eyes, dressed like she came out of a city office. She showed up one day saying she was a family friend, here to help. Hannah was too weak to argue by then. Victoria started making decisions, locking doors, keeping people out. I tried to visit, but she'd meet me on the porch and tell me to leave food at the gate. Mason leaned back, frowning. And when Hannah passed? She was just gone. I came by a week later and found the place empty except for Luna. No feed, no sign anyone had been here. Eleanor's voice dropped. "I left food when I could, but I've seen the way Victoria looks at people who cross her. She's not someone you want for an enemy." Mason's mind worked quietly. His time in uniform had taught him to listen for what wasn't said. Eleanor's story painted Victoria as someone who wanted control. But why over an old house and a wild animal? He glanced toward the porch where Luna's silhouette shifted against the light. "You still haven't told me about the name," Mason said quietly. "My name." On that piece of wool Luna was holding. Eleanor sighed, a long, deliberate exhale. "I was hoping Ryan would be the one to tell you. It's his family history, after all." "Tell me what?" "That Hannah knew you, Mason. You two were children together." Eleanor's eyes held his. "Before your family moved away, before you joined the army." Mason stared at her, searching his memory. Hannah Morgan. The name stirred something distant, like an echo across mountains. A flash of a young girl with auburn hair, laughing as they climbed the rocks behind the school. Was that Hannah? It had been so long ago, and the years of combat had blurred many of his earlier memories. I don't remember, he admitted. You were young, Eleanor said gently. 10, maybe 11 when your family left. Hannah was a year younger. She never forgot you, though. Said you two made some kind of promise before you left. Something about coming back to take care of this land together someday. Mason's throat tightened. A childhood promise, forgotten by him, but kept alive in someone else's heart for all these years. That's why the ranch was sold for $10, he realized aloud. She wanted me to have it. Eleanor nodded. Hannah knew she was dying. Cancer, spreading fast. She told me once she'd fix things so you'd get the ranch if you ever came back to Durango. Her expression clouded. But then Victoria showed up, started talking about papers and legal things. I think she found out something about this land that made her want it bad. What could be valuable about a rundown ranch? I don't know for certain, but there's been men in suits walking the far pasture last summer, taking soil samples, talking about mineral rights. Eleanor rose to leave, but before she did, she placed a folded scrap of paper on the table. Old phone number for Ryan Morgan. Don't know if it still works, but he might know more than I do. After she left, Mason dialed the number from his cell. It rang until a man's voice, rough with sleep, answered. Ryan Morgan, he introduced himself. Hannah's older cousin, a truck driver based out of Santa Fe. Mason explained who he was and how he'd found Luna. There was a long pause before Ryan spoke. Hannah mentioned you once, he said slowly. Said you were the guy from Durango who left when you were kids, the one she made the promise with. He hesitated. Listen, I didn't even know she was that sick until it was too late. By the time I drove up, the funeral was over. Victoria told me everything was handled. His voice hardened. I didn't trust her then. Don't trust her now. They talked for another 10 minutes, Mason steering the conversation toward any documents or belongings Hannah might have left. Ryan said he'd check his storage unit and call back. Take care of Luna, Ryan added before hanging up. Hannah loved that cat more than anything. That evening, the weather turned. Clouds rolled down from the mountains, and the wind began to hum through the gaps in the old siding. Mason worked by the dim light of a single lamp, clearing debris from the living room and patching a draft near the window. Luna ventured inside, padding silently across the floorboards. She sniffed at the corners, inspected the wood stove, then settled on the blanket in the kitchen. Mason sat nearby, repairing a loose buckle on his pack. He caught himself speaking without thinking. Looks like you've had this place to yourself too long. Luna blinked slowly at him, a cat's half approval. Later, as the wind rattled the shutters, Mason placed another small meal beside her blanket. This time, when she finished, she didn't retreat. She stayed where she was, her eyes half closed, as if testing the idea of peace. Outside, Durango's streetlights glowed dim through the mist, and the ranch stood like a solitary island in the night. Mason knew this was no simple case of an abandoned property. There were holes in the story, holes that someone like Victoria would rather keep covered. Somewhere in the quiet between Luna's slow breathing and the hiss of the wind, Mason decided he would find out exactly why. By mid-morning, a pale winter sun pushed through the clouds, its weak light spilling into the bedroom of the old ranch house. The air still carried the faint chill of the night before, and Mason worked with his jacket on, rolling up dusty rugs and sweeping out years of grit from the floorboards. Luna lay on the threshold, her tail twitching, watching him with quiet curiosity, as though measuring his claim to the space. As he dragged a cedar chest toward the far wall, the sound of wood scraping against wood rang oddly hollow. Mason paused. He knelt and rapped the boards with his knuckles. Most sounded solid, but one gave a muted echo. Pulling his multi-tool from his pocket, he worked the tip between two planks and pried one up. A shallow compartment lay hidden beneath, the edges lined with dry, splintered pine. Inside sat a small, leather-bound journal, its brown cover worn soft at the corners, and beneath it, a folded stack of papers bound with faded blue ribbon. The smell of lavender and dust rose up, an echo of a woman's hand. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the journal. The handwriting inside was elegant but uneven in places, as if penned by someone growing weaker with each entry. The earliest pages spoke of life on the ranch, the changing seasons, Luna's first attempts at hunting, small triumphs like repairing a fence before the first snow. But as the pages turned, a tone of unease began to creep in. The name Victoria appeared more often, paired with words like pressure, a bomb, papers, and trust broken. One entry stopped Mason cold. She says if I don't sign, Luna will be taken somewhere I'll never find her. He set the journal down and reached for the ribbon-bound papers. The top sheet was a will, in handwritten but unsigned. It left the entire property, all assets, in the care of Luna to my lawful guardian if that guardian should return, Mason Reed, was written in deliberate strokes, or failing that, to the Colorado Wildlife Protection Trust. The legal phrasing was imperfect, but the intent was unmistakable. Mason's jaw tightened. This was more than a keepsake. It was leverage, the kind that could expose whatever Victoria had done to push the official paperwork through. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew his attention. From the bedroom window, he saw a tan pickup pull up outside. A tall man stepped out, wearing a canvas work jacket and a baseball cap, stained from years of sweat and sun. He carried himself with an easy gait, the kind of loose confidence of someone who worked outdoors every day. Mason met him at the porch. The man tipped his cap. Name's Nathan Daniels. I work for the county assessor's office. Heard there's a new owner out here. His voice was even, but his eyes scanned the property with the instinct of someone cataloging details. Mason introduced himself and invited him in. Over coffee, Nathan explained he had been sent to confirm the property's transfer and check for any structures not listed on record. Thing is, Nathan said, this place has a history. Couple years back, paperwork changed hands faster than usual. No inspection, no tax review. Never sat right with me. When Mason asked about Victoria, Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. Saw her in the assessor's office once. Slick talker, always on a phone. She knew how to get people to move paper without asking too many questions. If she's involved, I'd keep your eyes open. Mason debated whether to mention the journal and the will, but decided against it for now. Trust was earned slowly in his world. Instead, he steered the conversation to the property's original records. Nathan promised to dig through the county archives and left with a firm handshake. That afternoon, Mason wrapped the journal and will in a clean cloth, slid them into his pack, and drove into town. The law office of Alexander Hayes sat in an old brick building on Main Street, its front windows lined with dusty legal tomes. Alexander was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered with dark hair just starting to gray at the temples. Years as a JAG officer in the military had given him a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, but his eyes softened when he saw Mason. "Reed," Alexander said, rising from behind his desk. "Didn't think I'd see you back here." Mason laid the bundle on the desk and unwrapped it. He spoke little, letting Alexander turn the pages himself. Alexander read in silence for several minutes, his expression shifting from curiosity to concentration to something harder. "This," Alexander said at last, tapping the unsigned will, "isn't just a family keepsake. It's the decedent's clear intent. If the official will contradicts this, and we can prove the contradiction was forced or fraudulent, we can get a judge to reopen the estate case. And if you're named as the intended guardian, you have got standing to claim both the property and the Bobcat." He flipped to the journal entries. "And these notes about Victoria's threats may not be admissible as hard evidence without corroboration, but they support a pattern of coercion. We'll need more witness statements, records from the Wildlife Trust, maybe even a handwriting expert to verify this is Hannah's writing." Mason leaned back. "Nathan Daniels from the assessor's office thinks the property transfer was rushed. He's looking into the archives." "Good," Alexander said. "If he finds irregularities, that's another piece in the puzzle." He met Mason's gaze. "But Reed, if Victoria went to this much trouble, she won't just let it go. You ready for that fight?" Mason thought of Luna on the porch, the way she had watched him with that unblinking, waiting stare. He thought of the piece of wool with his name, carefully embroidered and preserved all these years. He thought of Hannah Morgan, a woman he barely remembered, who had remembered him. "I'm ready." Before leaving, Alexander handed him a small voice recorder. "Carry this. If she shows up, get her talking. Even small admissions can be useful." Back at the ranch, the wind had picked up, rattling the tin roof. Mason found Luna inside, curled on the blanket in the kitchen. He crouched down, resting a hand on the floor near her. "Looks like we've got work to do," he said quietly. She blinked at him, slow and deliberate, as if she understood more than he could guess. Outside, the late afternoon shadows stretched long across the valley, and somewhere beyond the mountains, a storm was gathering. Mason felt it in the air, in the restless way the wind changed direction, in the electric tension that made Luna's fur stand slightly on end. He wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. He was fighting for a promise he'd forgotten, but that someone else had kept. And for Luna, who had waited all this time for someone to come back. As night fell, Mason sat at the kitchen table with Hannah's journal open before him, trying to piece together the fragments of a life he should have known. In the dim lamplight, Luna stretched out beside the wood stove, her golden eyes reflecting the flames as they danced. They were both guardians of this place now. A soldier and a wild thing, bound by a trust neither fully understood, but both somehow needed. The morning brought cold rain to the Morgan Ranch, water dripping through small cracks in the ceiling and pooling on the worn floorboards. Mason worked methodically, placing buckets and pots under the worst leaks, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to addressing immediate threats before they could escalate. Luna watched from her corner, occasionally shaking droplets from her fur when they fell too close. By noon, the rain had softened to a steady mist that hung over the valley like a veil. Mason stood at the kitchen window, nursing a cup of instant coffee as he watched the moisture collect on the overgrown grass. The journal lay open on the table, its pages filled with Hannah's increasingly unsteady handwriting. He had read it twice now, piecing together the story of a woman fighting two battles, one against the cancer consuming her body, the other against Victoria Stone's methodical encroachment on her life. The most recent entries troubled him most. They spoke of Victoria's increasing presence, her discussions with men in expensive suits, hushed phone calls about extraction permits, and mineral assessments. Hannah had written about feeling trapped, too weak to resist as Victoria presented document after document for her signature. In one of the final entries, dated just 3 weeks before her death, she had written, "I've hidden what matters most. If Mason ever returns, he'll know what to do." The words haunted him. What had she hidden, and why had she been so certain he would understand when he could barely remember her? Mason's phone buzzed on the counter. Ryan Morgan's number flashed on the screen. "I found something," Ryan said without preamble when Mason answered. "Going through Hannah's boxes. There's a file about the ranch, property surveys, some old maps, and a letter addressed to you." Mason's grip tightened on the phone. "A letter?" "Sealed envelope with your name on it, Hannah's handwriting." "Want me to open it?" "No," Mason said quickly. "Can you bring it here today?" "I'm on the road heading to Denver, but I can detour to Durango, be there by evening." "I appreciate it." After hanging up, Mason returned to the journal, scanning for any mention of a letter. Nothing specific, but Hannah had referenced leaving breadcrumbs for him to follow. Perhaps this was one of them. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled him from his thoughts. He moved to the window, expecting to see Eleanor's old station wagon. Instead, a gleaming black SUV with government plates was making its way up the muddy drive. Mason's muscles tensed instinctively, the old combat wariness flooding back. Two figures emerged from the vehicle, a tall man in a ranger's uniform and a shorter woman in a dark business suit, both holding clipboards beneath rain jackets. The man approached the porch while the woman lingered near the vehicle, surveying the property with obvious displeasure. Mason stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him to keep Luna inside. "Can I help you?" The ranger removed his hat, revealing a weathered face with sharp blue eyes. "Jason Mitchell, Colorado Wildlife Services. This is Diane Reynolds from the County Land Commission." "Mason Reed," he replied, not extending his hand. "Mr. Reed," Mitchell continued, "we've received a report that you're harboring a protected wild animal on this property without proper permits or facilities." "Who filed the report?" Mitchell consulted his clipboard. "Anonymous tip, but our office takes all wildlife welfare concerns seriously." The woman, Diane, had approached now, her heels sinking slightly into the wet earth. "Additionally, Mr. Reed, there are questions about the legality of your ownership claim. This property was designated for conservation trust management following Ms. Morgan's death." Mason kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. Victoria's hand, no doubt. "I purchased this property legally through Walter Graves Real Estate. I have the paperwork inside. May we come in and discuss this? Mitchell asked, and we'll need to evaluate the Bobcat's condition. Mason hesitated, remembering Alexander's warning about being careful who he let in, but refusing would only escalate the situation. Give me a minute. Inside, he quickly tucked Hannah's journal into a drawer, then coaxed Luna into the bedroom, closing the door to keep her separated from the visitors. When he returned to the porch, both officials had removed their rain gear and were waiting expectantly. He led them into the kitchen, pulling out the property transfer documents Walter had given him. Diane examined them with obvious skepticism. This transaction lacks several required signatures and approvals, she said, flipping through the pages. And there's no record of an environmental impact assessment, which is mandatory for rural properties over 50 acres. I wasn't made aware of that, Mason replied. Mitchell, meanwhile, was scanning the room, his eyes lingering on the makeshift bed in the corner with Luna's blanket. Where is the animal now? Somewhere safe. Mitchell's eyebrows rose. Mr. Reed, obstructing a wildlife officer in the performance of his duties is a serious offense. So is harassment based on anonymous tips, Mason countered. I'd like to know exactly what you're accusing me of before I cooperate further. The wildlife officer's expression hardened. Very well. You've been reported for illegal possession of a protected species, failure to maintain appropriate habitat for said species, and potential wildlife exploitation. Exploitation? Mason couldn't keep the edge from his voice. The report suggested you might be planning to use the Bobcat for commercial purposes. Photography, social media, perhaps even breeding. The accusation was so absurd that Mason almost laughed. Instead, he took a deep breath. Luna was raised here by Hannah Morgan. She's semi-domesticated and has been on this property for years. I'm simply continuing her care. Without permits or proper training, Mitchell pressed. I'm working on that, Mason said, thinking of the wildlife rehabilitation documents he'd found among Hannah's papers. Hannah had the necessary permissions. I assumed they would transfer. Diane cleared her throat. Permits for exotic animal care are attached to individuals, not properties, Mr. Reed. They require extensive background checks, facility inspections, and professional references. Then I'll apply for them. Mitchell shook his head. In the meantime, the animal will need to be relocated to a licensed facility. From behind the bedroom door came a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of Luna's low growl. Mitchell's head snapped toward the noise. Is that the Bobcat? Mason positioned himself between the wildlife officer and the bedroom door. Like I said, she's safe. I need to assess her condition, Mitchell insisted, taking a step forward. Not without a warrant, Mason said, his voice dropping to the quiet, determined tone that had once commanded men in combat. Unless you have cause to believe she's in immediate danger. Mitchell and Diane exchanged glances. We'll be back with the proper documentation, Diane said finally. In the meantime, this property remains under investigation, and you are formally notified not to remove the animal from the premises or alter the property in any significant way. She placed an official-looking notice on the table. You have 72 hours to produce valid permits for keeping a protected wild species, or will be forced to confiscate the animal and possibly press charges. After they left, Mason went to the bedroom and opened the door. Luna was crouched beneath the window, her ears flattened against her head, golden eyes wide with obvious distress. He knelt a few feet away from her, speaking in low, soothing tones until her posture relaxed slightly. They won't take you, he promised. I won't let them. He returned to the kitchen and dialed Alexander's number. The lawyer listened silently as Mason recounted the visit. They're moving fast, Alexander said when Mason finished. Victoria must have connections in the county offices. What can we do? I'll file an emergency petition claiming prior established care relationship and cite Hannah's original permits. It might buy us some time. Meanwhile, see what Ryan brings. If Hannah left you a letter, it could strengthen our case that she intended you to have guardianship of both the property and Luna. Mason spent the afternoon reinforcing the patched roof, working through the drizzle with a roll of tar paper and a staple gun he'd found in the shed. The physical labor helped clear his head, the repetitive motion of measuring, cutting, and securing giving him space to think. By evening, the rain had stopped, and a thin band of orange light glowed along the western horizon. The sound of tires on gravel announced Ryan Morgan's arrival. Ryan was younger than Mason had expected, early 30s at most, with Hannah's auburn hair and a trucker's solid build. He carried a cardboard box from his pickup to the porch, nodding a greeting. "You must be Mason," he said, extending a hand. "Hannah talked about you, said you were the bravest kid in Durango." Mason shook his hand, searching Ryan's face for any resemblance to the girl in his fragmented memories. "I wish I remembered her better." Inside, Ryan set the box on the kitchen table and glanced around. "Where's Luna?" Sleeping by the stove, Mason nodded toward the living room, where the Bobcat was curled on a blanket near the wood stove's fading warmth. Ryan approached slowly, crouching at a respectful distance. "Hey there, girl. Remember me?" Luna's eyes opened to narrow slits, regarding Ryan with cautious recognition. Her tail flicked once, but she remained in place. "She knows you," Mason observed. "Used to bring her treats when I visited," Ryan said, straightening. "Special jerky from this butcher in Santa Fe. She'd take it right from my hand by the end." He returned to the box and began removing items. A stack of manila folders, a photo album, and a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "This is what I found so far," he said, sliding the envelope toward Mason. "Hannah's handwriting, like I said." Mason picked it up, studying his name written in careful cursive on the front. The paper felt fragile, as if it might disintegrate at the wrong touch. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. The letter was dated 8 years earlier, long before Hannah's illness. "Dear Mason, if you're reading this, then you found your way back to Durango and to our ranch. I've always believed you would return someday, though I know the promise we made as children might not mean to you what it has to me. The Morgan Ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, but it was never just ours. Your mother's family, the Kavanaughs, were the original homesteaders. They lost it during the Depression. My grandfather bought it, but he always said it belonged to both our families in spirit. I'm entrusting Luna to you because you were always kind to wild things. Remember the fox kit we found? You spent 3 days building it a safe place before we released it. There's more to this land than most people know. If trouble comes, look beneath the stones where we carved our initials. What's buried there might explain why some people suddenly find this worthless land so valuable. Your friend always," Hannah Mason stared at the letter, a memory surfacing like a bubble breaking the water's surface. 2 children, sitting on sun-warmed rocks by a creek, carving clumsy letters into a flat stone with a pocket knife borrowed from his father. MR plus HM. Forever. "There's a creek on the eastern edge of the property," Ryan said, watching Mason's expression. "Hannah used to go there almost every day, even when she got sick. Said it was her thinking spot." Mason slipped the key into his pocket. "What else can you tell me about Victoria Stone?" Ryan's face darkened. "Corporate lawyer from Denver, specializes in land acquisition for mining companies. Started showing up when Hannah was at her weakest, claiming to be an old family friend, though I'd never heard of her before." "And after Hannah died?" "Victoria produced a will leaving her as executor of the estate. Said Hannah wanted the land put in a conservation trust, but somehow Victoria ended up with power of attorney over all the decisions." He shook his head. "I tried to contest it, but I'm just a long-haul trucker with no money for fancy lawyers. By the time I could get back to Durango, Victoria had already pushed the paperwork through." "What about Luna?" "Victoria claimed she'd arranged for a wildlife sanctuary to take her, but apparently she just abandoned her here." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I would have taken Luna myself if I'd known, but my apartment doesn't allow pets, let alone wild animals." Mason opened one of the folders, finding property surveys dating back to the 1950s. Nothing seemed unusual until he reached a newer document, a geological survey from just 18 months ago. "Did you know about this?" he asked, showing it to Ryan. Ryan frowned, studying the technical diagram. "No, what is it?" "Mineral survey. According to this, there's a significant rare earth mineral deposit running through the eastern part of the property. Neodymium, primarily." "What's that worth?" "Millions," Mason said grimly. "It's essential for high-strength magnets, electric vehicles, wind turbines. And China controls most of the world's supply, so domestic sources are extremely valuable." Ryan whistled low. No wonder Victoria wanted the land. Not just the land, Mason realized. Control of it. A conservation trust would prevent development, but as executor, she could potentially lease mineral rights or even arrange for limited extraction under certain conditions. He thought of the creek Hannah had mentioned, on the eastern edge, right where the mineral deposits would be richest. I need to find that stone. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Mason rose before sunrise, filling a thermos with coffee and packing a small bag with tools, a trowel, work gloves, and a flashlight. Luna watched from her blanket, ears perked with interest. "Want to come?" Mason asked. And to his surprise, the bobcat rose and stretched, then padded to the door as if she understood perfectly. They followed a faint trail that wound through scrubby pine and juniper toward the eastern property line. The path grew clearer as they continued, evidence of frequent use. Luna moved ahead of him now, her steps purposeful, as if she knew exactly where they were going. After 20 minutes, the sound of running water reached them. The trail descended into a small ravine where a creek cut through the rocky soil. Tall limestone formations created a natural enclosure around a pool of clear water, a secluded sanctuary away from the main house. Luna leapt gracefully onto one of the larger, flatter rocks beside the pool and sat, her tail curled around her feet, watching Mason expectantly. "This is it, isn't it?" he said. "Hannah's thinking spot." He climbed onto the rock formation, scanning the surfaces for any sign of carved initials. Nothing on the first large stone, nor the second. On the third, a flat, table-like rock that jutted over the water, he found them, MR plus HM. The letters weathered but still legible, with a lopsided heart carved around them. Mason ran his fingers over the rough indentations, another memory surfacing. Hannah insisting they make it official, that the ranch would be their secret kingdom someday. He'd thought it was just a child's game. "Beneath the stones," he murmured, recalling Hannah's letter. He examined the ground around the carved rock, finding nothing unusual. Then he looked more closely at the stone itself. It was large, perhaps 3 feet across, but not part of the natural formation. It had been placed here deliberately. Using a sturdy branch as a lever, Mason worked the edge of the flat stone upward. It lifted reluctantly, revealing damp soil beneath. Luna moved closer, watching with obvious interest as Mason began to dig. 6 inches down, his trowel struck something solid. He cleared away more dirt, uncovering a small metal box, its surface coated with red-brown rust. The keyhole was nearly obscured by corrosion. Mason removed Hannah's brass key from his pocket and carefully worked it into the lock. It took several attempts, but finally the mechanism gave way with a reluctant click. Inside the box, protected by a watertight seal, were several folded documents in a small cloth pouch. Mason opened the papers first. The topmost document was a handwritten letter dated just weeks before Hannah's death. "Mason, if you're reading this, then you've remembered our special place. I always hoped you would. What you hold now is the truth about the Morgan Ranch, our ranch. The original deed shows that the property was jointly owned by both our families until 1932, when your great-grandfather James Kavanaugh was forced to sell his half to my grandfather during the Depression. But he never sold the mineral rights. Those remained with the Kavanaugh family, separated from the land deed through a legal provision that my grandfather honored. Your mother may not even know about this inheritance, as the documentation was thought lost in the courthouse fire of 1974. The second document is a certified copy of the mineral rights deed, which I found among my grandfather's papers after he died. By law, these rights still belong to your family. The third document is my notarized statement confirming this fact and relinquishing any Morgan family claim to these resources. Victoria discovered this history when she helped me research the property's legal status. When she realized the potential value, she began pressuring me to challenge the mineral rights, to claim they had reverted to the Morgan family through abandonment. I refused. That's when she started insisting I needed a formal will, one that would give her authority over the property. When I resisted, she threatened to report Luna to the wildlife authorities, to have her taken away or even euthanized. The truth, Mason, is that the mineral deposits beneath this land are worth millions. Companies have been quietly buying up surrounding properties for years, anticipating a rare earth mining boom. Victoria represents Highland Resource Development, though she pretended to be working independently. In the cloth pouch, you'll find soil samples in the lab results confirming the deposits. With these documents, you can prove your family's claim to the mineral rights and stop Victoria's plans to strip mine our sanctuary. I'm sorry to place this burden on you, but I have no one else to trust. Take care of Luna. She's the purest soul I've ever known, and she remembers you, even if you don't remember us." Hannah Mason's hands were shaking slightly as he set down the letter. He removed the remaining documents, confirming they matched Hannah's description. The original split deed from 1932, showing the separation of mineral rights from the land title, and Hannah's notarized statement relinquishing any Morgan claim to those rights. The cloth pouch contained 3 small vials of soil samples and a laboratory report indicating high concentrations of neodymium, praseodymium, and other rare earth elements. Luna had settled beside him, her warm presence a silent comfort as he processed what he'd discovered. It wasn't just about a bobcat and a rundown ranch anymore. It was about millions of dollars in mineral rights, corporate manipulation, and a dying woman's attempt to preserve both her family's honor and the land she loved. Mason carefully returned everything to the metal box, except for the documents proving the Kavanaugh family's ownership of the mineral rights. Those he placed securely in his jacket pocket. As he stood, a flash of movement across the creek caught his attention. Luna saw it too, her body instantly alert, muscles tensing beneath her spotted coat. A figure in dark clothing ducked behind a tree on the far bank. Mason whistled softly, signaling Luna to follow him as he moved behind the largest rock formation for cover. Years of combat training took over as he scanned the area, identifying potential threats and escape routes. The figure emerged again, moving parallel to the creek. A woman in expensive hiking gear, carrying what looked like surveying equipment. Even at this distance, Mason recognized her from Hannah's descriptions. Tall, sharp-featured, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. Victoria Stone. She hadn't seen them yet, her attention focused on a handheld GPS device as she marked waypoints along the creek bed. Mason remained perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on Luna's back to keep her from moving. The bobcat seemed to understand the need for silence, her golden eyes fixed on the intruder. Victoria continued along the creek for several minutes, occasionally stopping to make notes or take photographs. She was methodically documenting the entire eastern edge of the property, precisely where the mineral deposits were richest. When she finally moved out of sight, heading north along the property line, Mason waited another 5 minutes before signaling to Luna that it was safe to move. They returned to the ranch house by a different route, keeping to the densest cover and moving as quietly as possible. As they approached the clearing where the house stood, Mason spotted a black SUV parked near the front gate, the same vehicle he'd seen the day before with the wildlife officer and county official. This time, Victoria Stone leaned against its hood, speaking intently with Jason Mitchell. Mason hung back among the trees, observing the interaction. No friendly conversation between strangers. This was clearly a coordinated effort. Victoria handed Mitchell a folder, then checked her watch with obvious impatience. The wildlife officer nodded several times, his expression grim as he returned to his vehicle. When both had driven away, Mason and Luna emerged from cover. The house appeared undisturbed, but Mason approached cautiously, checking for signs of entry. Finding none, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The phone was ringing. Mason answered to hear Alexander's urgent voice. "They've escalated things," the lawyer said without preamble. "I just received notice that the county is challenging your purchase of the property based on improper transfer procedures. They're also seeking an emergency order to remove Luna, claiming she represents a public safety risk and that you're an unqualified caretaker." "Victoria's behind it," Mason said. "I just saw her meeting with the wildlife officer. She's surveying the eastern creek bed, exactly where the mineral deposits are richest." "What mineral deposits?" Mason quickly explained what he'd found in Hannah's hidden box. "I have documentation proving my family still owns the mineral rights, separated from the land deeds since the 1930s. Alexander was silent for a moment, processing this information. "That changes everything," he finally said. "If you can prove ancestral mineral rights ownership, Victoria's entire strategy collapses. She needs control of both the land and the mineral rights to move forward with any mining operation. The documents look legitimate, but they're nearly a century old. Bring them to my office immediately. I have a contact at the county records department who can verify their authenticity against the original land registers." Alexander paused. "And Mason, be careful. If these rights are as valuable as you say, Victoria won't give up easily." "What about Luna? They're coming for her tomorrow." "I filed for an emergency stay, citing Hannah's original rehabilitation permit and your family connection to both Hannah and the property. It might delay them, but we'll need more." Mason looked at Luna, who had settled on her blanket near the stove, exhausted from their morning trek. I'm not letting them take her. Then we need to move fast. The hearing is set for Monday morning. That gives us 3 days to build our case. As Mason hung up, he heard Luna's low warning growl. He turned to see her staring intently at the window, her ears flattened against her head. Outside, a dark sedan had pulled up alongside the house, and a well-dressed woman was approaching the front door. Victoria Stone had returned, and this time, she was coming straight for them. Mason moved quickly to the door, slipping Hannah's documents into his jacket pocket. Luna remained by the wood stove, her body tense, golden eyes fixed on the approaching threat. The knock, when it came, was sharp and authoritative, 3 precise raps that echoed through the quiet house. Mason took a deep breath, centering himself as he'd done countless times before combat operations. He activated the voice recorder Alexander had given him, slipping it into his shirt pocket before opening the door. Victoria Stone stood on the porch, immaculately dressed in a charcoal pantsuit despite the rural setting. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, emphasizing her angular features and cool gray eyes. She was taller than Mason had expected, nearly matching his 6-foot frame in her heeled boots. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice smooth and professional. "I'm Victoria Stone, executor of Hannah Morgan's estate. I believe we need to talk." Mason didn't invite her in. About what? If his coldness bothered her, she didn't show it. "There seems to be some confusion regarding your occupancy of this property. The Morgan Ranch was designated for Conservation Trust management following Hannah's death. Your purchase is, unfortunately, invalid." "I have the deed transfer papers," Mason replied evenly. "Signed by Walter Graves, who had no authority to sell this property," Victoria countered. "As Hannah's chosen executor, I'm the only person legally authorized to make decisions regarding this land. Chosen under questionable circumstances, from what I've heard." A flicker of something, annoyance or perhaps wariness, crossed Victoria's face before her professional mask slipped back into place. "I understand you've been speaking with Eleanor Parker and Ryan Morgan. They're understandably emotional about Hannah's passing, but neither was involved in her final legal arrangements." "And you were?" "Hannah asked for my help when she realized her condition was terminal. She wanted to ensure her property would be protected from development." Victoria glanced past him into the house. "Including arrangements for the Bobcat." At the mention of Luna, Mason felt a surge of protectiveness. "Luna seems to have been abandoned here after Hannah died. Strange care for a valued pet." Victoria's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "A regrettable oversight during a difficult transition. The wildlife sanctuary I'd arranged had an unexpected funding issue and couldn't take her immediately. I'm here partly to rectify that situation." "By having her seized by the wildlife authorities?" This time, Victoria's surprise seemed genuine. "I see Jason's already been here. I asked him to assess her condition, not seize her. He threatened to take her unless I produce permits I don't have." Victoria sighed, a practiced sound of professional concern. "A misunderstanding, I'm sure. Perhaps we could discuss this aside. The weather's turning." Mason hesitated, then stepped back, allowing her entry but positioning himself to keep Luna in view. The Bobcat had retreated further into the shadow of the wood stove, her eyes never leaving Victoria. Victoria surveyed the sparse interior with poorly disguised distaste. "You've been settling in." "It needs work," Mason acknowledged. "More than work, Mr. Reed. This structure should probably be condemned. The Conservation Trust had plans to demolish it and restore the entire area to its natural state. Convenient for accessing what's beneath the soil." Victoria's eyes snapped to his, suddenly sharp with interest. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do." Mason moved to the kitchen table, deliberately placing himself between Victoria and Luna. "Highland Resource Development has been very interested in this area recently, particularly the eastern creek bed." Victoria's composure faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Many environmental organizations monitor water quality in rural areas. It's standard conservation practice. Most conservation groups don't take soil core samples 20 feet deep." "Mr. Reed," Victoria said, her tone hardening, "I came here to offer you a reasonable solution to this unfortunate situation. The trust is prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience, say $25,000, if you vacate the property voluntarily within 48 hours. Mason kept his expression neutral. That's generous for a $10 investment. We recognize you acted in good faith even if the purchase was invalid. And Luna? Will be relocated to a proper wildlife facility, as Hannah would have wanted. Mason shook his head. Hannah wanted her here, with me. Victoria's professional veneer cracked slightly, frustration bleeding through. That's absurd. You weren't even in contact with Hannah during her illness. I was there every day for months, handling her medical arrangements, her legal affairs, everything she needed. Like pressuring her to sign over control of the mineral rights? The question landed like a physical blow. Victoria stiffened, her eyes narrowing. I don't know what you think you've discovered, Mr. Reed, but Hannah Morgan signed a legally binding will naming me as her executor. Everything else is speculation and hearsay. Not everything. Mason withdrew to the mineral rights document from a pocket, holding it just out of her reach. My family never sold the mineral rights to this property. They've belonged to the Kavanaughs since before the Depression. Victoria stared at the document, a complex series of emotions flickering across her face. Shock, calculation, and then something harder. Where did you get that? Hannah left it for me, along with her notarized statement confirming the Morgan family's recognition of our ownership. That's impossible, Victoria snapped, her composure fully breaking now. I searched every inch of this property. There were no such documents. Hannah knew you were looking. She hid them where only I would find them. Victoria's hand twitched toward the document, but Mason returned it to his pocket. She drew herself up, visibly reassembling her professional demeanor. Even if such a document exists, its validity would be highly questionable after nearly a century. Mineral rights revert to the surface owner, if not actively maintained or registered with each property transfer. No court would uphold such an antiquated claim. We'll see what the judge says on Monday. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. You've already filed a case? My lawyer has, along with an emergency petition to block Luna's removal and contest your executor status. A tense silence filled the room. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling through the cracks in the old siding. Luna had crept closer to Mason, her muscular body pressed against his leg, as if lending support. Finally, Victoria spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. You have no idea what you're involved in, Mr. Reed. Highland Resource Development isn't some small-time operation. They've invested millions in preliminary exploration of this region. They have connections in every level of county government. Is that a threat? It's reality. This will get ugly and quickly. A man with your background should understand the concept of choosing your battles wisely. Mason felt a cold anger spreading through his chest. My background? Victoria's smile was thin. 3 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge following a roadside IED incident, possible PTSD diagnosis, all matters of public record. Mr. Reed, how do you think a judge will view your fitness to care for a dangerous wild animal when your own psychological stability could be questioned? The deliberate calculation of her attack was almost admirable. Mason had faced similar psychological warfare in interrogation training. He kept his expression neutral, though he noted with satisfaction that the recorder in his pocket was capturing every word. I appreciate your concern for my well-being, he said evenly. Is there anything else you wanted to discuss today? Victoria studied him for a long moment, apparently reassessing her approach. Consider my offer, Mr. Reed. $25,000 is substantial compensation for walking away from a property you've owned for less than a week. The alternative will be costly, time-consuming, and ultimately futile. I'll keep that in mind. She reached into her handbag and withdrew a business card, placing it on the table. When you're ready to discuss terms, call me directly. No need to involve lawyers if we can settle this amicably. As Victoria turned to leave, Luna growled low in her throat. Not aggressive, but clearly communicating her distrust. Victoria froze, then carefully sidestepped toward the door. That animal should be with professionals, she said, her voice tight. It's a wild predator, not a house pet. She knows exactly who belongs here and who doesn't, Mason replied quietly. After Victoria's sleek sedan had disappeared down the driveway, Mason let out a long breath, stroking Luna's head gently. Good girl, he murmured. You saw right through her, didn't you? He retrieved the voice recorder and played back the conversation. Victoria's implied threats about his military background and her admission of searching the property for documents would strengthen their case. Most damning was her acknowledgement of Highland Resource Development's involvement and investment in the area, contradicting her claims about pure conservation interests. Mason called Alexander immediately, summarizing the confrontation. She's worried, Alexander said when Mason finished. That offer, $25,000 to walk away, that's a desperate move. If the mineral rights are as valuable as you believe, they'd normally start with at least 10 times that amount. She didn't expect me to know about the minerals, Mason agreed, or to have documentation of my family's rights. Bring everything to my office now, Alexander urged. I don't trust her not to take more aggressive action once she regroups. Mason glanced at Luna. What about Luna? I can't leave her alone. Bring her too. My office is on private property, and I have a fenced courtyard. She'll be safer there than at the ranch right now. Getting Luna into the truck proved surprisingly simple. Whether from her trust in Mason or some understanding of the danger, she allowed him to guide her into a large dog crate he'd lined with her familiar blanket. She settled inside without protest, her golden eyes watching him steadily through the grate. Alexander's law office occupied a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of Durango, set back from the road and surrounded by mature pine trees. A high adobe wall enclosed a courtyard behind the building. Mason parked at the rear entrance, where Alexander was waiting to help him bring Luna inside. The lawyer's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the Bobcat, who emerged cautiously from the crate, scanning her new surroundings. She's magnificent, Alexander murmured, and calmer than I expected. She seems to understand who's trying to help and who isn't, Mason said, watching as Luna explored the perimeter of the courtyard before settling in a patch of late afternoon sunlight. Inside Alexander's cluttered office, Mason spread out the documents from Hannah's metal box. The lawyer examined them carefully, occasionally referencing legal texts from his shelves. The mineral rights documentation appears legitimate, he said finally. The separate deed is properly executed according to the standards of the time. Hannah's notarized statement further strengthens your position. He looked up at Mason. But Victoria's right about one thing. These claims can be challenged due to abandonment if they weren't properly maintained or registered during subsequent property transfers. What does that mean for our case? We need to establish a clear chain of ownership from your great-grandfather to you. That means finding any references to these mineral rights in your family records, wills, estate documents, anything that shows the rights were consciously retained and passed down. Mason ran a hand through his hair. I don't have access to my family's papers. My mother moved to Arizona years ago after my father died. I haven't spoken to her in a long time. Alexander's expression softened slightly. Then that's your next step. We need those records, Mason. Without them, Victoria could argue that the mineral rights were abandoned and reverted to the surface property owner, which would be Hannah's estate, under Victoria's control. Mason nodded, the weight of what lay ahead settling on his shoulders. Reconnecting with his mother meant confronting years of strained silence, of mutual disappointment and unresolved grief. I'll call her, he said finally. But I need to secure the ranch first. Victoria knows I found something important. She won't wait long to act. I've filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any alteration of the property pending our hearing, Alexander assured him, and I've arranged for a security service to monitor the ranch tonight. No one will get in without us knowing. The sun was setting as they returned to the courtyard. Luna had moved to the shelter of a small porch overhang, her spotted coat blending with the shadows. She lifted her head as Mason approached, a soft chuffing sound emanating from her throat. She can stay here tonight, Alexander offered. I'll sleep in the office. It's more secure than the ranch, especially if Victoria decides to escalate things. Mason hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. I need to make a difficult phone call. He sat in his truck in Alexander's parking lot, staring at his phone for several long minutes before finally dialing his mother's number. It rang 4 times before she answered, her voice exactly as he remembered it, clear and slightly cautious. Hello? Mom, he said, the word feeling strange after so long. It's Mason. A pause, then, Mason, are you all right? The question was so typical of their relationship. concern immediately tempered by the assumption that he only called when something was wrong. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm in Durango." "Durango? Why?" He took a deep breath. "I bought the Morgan Ranch. Or I thought I did. It's complicated." "The Morgan place?" Surprise colored her voice. "That old rundown property by the creek? Why would you want that?" "It's about the mineral rights, Mom. The ones that great-grandfather Kavanaugh kept when he sold the land during the Depression." The silence that followed was heavy with unasked questions. Finally, his mother spoke, her voice more subdued. "How do you know about those?" The question confirmed what Mason had hoped, that the rights hadn't been forgotten, that his mother was aware of them. "Hannah Morgan left documentation for me. She had copies of the original deed separation and records showing our family still legally owns the mineral rights." "Hannah," his mother repeated softly. "I remember her. She was that little girl who followed you everywhere one summer. Her grandfather helped your father find work when times were hard." "I need the family records, Mom. Anything about the mineral rights, especially documents showing they were passed down through the family. There's a mining company trying to claim them, and I need to prove our ownership wasn't abandoned." Another long pause. "I have your grandmother's papers in storage. I never went through them properly after she died. Your father always said there was something valuable in those old deeds, but we thought he meant sentimental value." "It's more than sentimental. There are rare earth minerals under the property worth millions." His mother's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Mason, what have you gotten yourself into?" "Something important," he said simply. "Can you find those papers?" "It would take me a few days to go through everything." "We don't have days. The hearing is Monday morning." "Monday?" She sounded taken aback. "That's impossible. I can't possibly—" "People are trying to steal what belongs to our family," Mason interrupted, a note of urgency entering his voice. "And they're willing to do whatever it takes. I need your help, Mom. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't crucial." The silence stretched between them, filled with years of unspoken regrets and missed opportunities. Then his mother sighed, a sound of reluctant acceptance. "I'll see what I can find tonight. There's a red metal file box in my storage unit with your grandmother's legal papers. If anything exists, it would be there." "Thank you," Mason said, relief washing through him. "I'm not doing this for the money," she added quickly. "I'm doing it because your father would have wanted to protect what belonged to his family." After hanging up, Mason returned to Alexander's office to find the lawyer deep in conversation with Ryan Morgan, who had arrived while Mason was on the phone. "Victoria's making moves," Ryan said without preamble. "She's called an emergency meeting of the Conservation Trust Board for tomorrow morning. My guess is she's going to try to push through some kind of immediate action before our hearing on Monday." "What kind of action?" Mason asked. "Could be anything from formally challenging your purchase to authorizing the wildlife authorities to remove Luna immediately," Alexander explained. "As executor, she has significant leeway to act in the best interests of Hannah's estate." "Can we stop her?" "My injunction should prevent any physical changes to the property, but it doesn't necessarily block administrative actions." Alexander rubbed his eyes wearily. "We need to be prepared for all contingencies." "I spoke to my mother," Mason said. "She knows about the mineral rights. They were mentioned in family discussions, and she believes she has documentation in my grandmother's papers." "That's crucial," Alexander said, straightening. "If we can establish that knowledge of the rights was maintained across generations, it strongly counters any abandonment claim." "She's looking for the documents tonight." Ryan had moved to the window overlooking the courtyard, where Luna was now pacing restlessly along the wall. "She senses something's wrong," he observed. "Hannah always said Luna could feel trouble coming before anyone else." As if confirming his words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley. Storm clouds had gathered over the mountains, obscuring the last light of day. "We should return to the ranch," Mason decided. "Victoria knows we've found something valuable. I don't trust her not to send someone to search for it, injunction or not." "The security team is already in place," Alexander reminded him. "2 men in a car at the gate," Mason countered. "The property covers 82 acres with multiple access points. Anyone who knows the land could easily bypass them." Ryan nodded. "He's right. There's an old logging road that cuts through the back property line. Locals use it for hunting access. You can drive right up to the eastern creek bed without ever passing the main entrance. Alexander considered this, then nodded reluctantly. Take my SUV in, he said, handing Mason his keys. It has four-wheel drive. I'll stay here with Luna and coordinate with the sheriff's office if we need backup. Mason and Ryan drove through the gathering darkness, rain beginning to spatter against the windshield as they left the outskirts of Durango behind. Ryan directed them to a narrow turnoff several miles past the ranch's main entrance, where a rutted dirt track disappeared into dense pine forest. This comes out about half a mile from the creek, Ryan explained as the SUV bounced over the uneven terrain. Hannah and I used to ride ATVs back here when we were teenagers. They cut the headlights as they approached the property line, using only the ambient light from the cloud-reflected town glow to navigate. The rain had intensified, turning the track into a slippery channel of mud that tested even the SUV's capabilities. Ryan pointed toward a faint light flickering through the trees ahead. Someone's there. Mason parked behind a thick stand of pines, and they continued on foot, moving silently despite the wet undergrowth. Years of combat operations had taught Mason how to move undetected, and Ryan, to his credit, followed his lead without question. As they drew closer to the creek, voices became audible. Two men, their tones hushed but urgent. Mason signaled Ryan to hold position while he crept forward to a vantage point behind a large boulder. In the weak light of a handheld lantern, two figures were methodically excavating the area around the flat stone where Mason had found Hannah's metal box. One wore the uniform of the County Wildlife Service, Jason Mitchell, while the other was dressed in dark clothing better suited for covert operations than official business. "There's nothing here," Mitchell was saying, frustration evident in his voice as he wiped rain from his face. "Stone said it would be buried near the creek marker." "Keep looking," the other man replied, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins. "The geological surveys indicate the richest deposits run directly beneath this formation. We need those soil sample reports before the hearing." Mitchell jabbed his shovel into the mud. "This is beyond my jurisdiction. I agreed to help with the Bobcat situation, not dig up half the countryside in the middle of the night." Ms. Stone was very clear about the importance of recovering any documents hidden on this property, the second man said coolly. "The compensation package she offered reflects that importance." Mason had heard enough. He retreated to Ryan's position and quickly outlined what he'd seen. "Mitchell's working for Victoria directly," he concluded, "and whoever that other man is, he's not from any conservation organization." Ryan's expression hardened. "So what do we do? Confront them?" Mason considered their options. Direct confrontation risked escalating the situation, potentially into violence. Documentation would be more valuable. "We need evidence of what they're doing," he decided. "Photos of them trespassing and searching the property in violation of the injunction." Ryan pulled out his phone. "No signal out here, but the camera still works." "Get into position on the ridge above the creek," Mason instructed. "You'll have a clear view of both of them. Take photos, then retreat to the vehicle. I'll create a distraction to give you cover if needed." As Ryan carefully worked his way toward the overlook, Mason circled around to approach from downstream, where the creek narrowed between steep banks. The rain provided excellent cover, masking small sounds and reducing visibility. From his new position, Mason could see that the men had expanded their search, digging several holes in a pattern around the creek bed. They had brought serious equipment, ground-penetrating radar and core sampling tools normally used for professional geological surveys. Mitchell was becoming increasingly agitated. "This is ridiculous. We've been here for hours and found nothing but mud and rocks." The other man checked a handheld device, frowning at the readings. "The density anomalies are strongest in this area. Whatever was buried here couldn't have gone far." "Unless Reed already found it," Mitchell suggested. "Stone said he knew something about mineral rights. What if he located whatever we're looking for days ago?" The European man stilled, considering this possibility. That would explain why he moved so quickly with legal action. He pulled out a satellite phone. "I need to inform Ms. Stone immediately." Mason recognized the danger. If Victoria learned that he had already secured the documentation, she might take more drastic measures before the hearing. He needed to buy time. Picking up a heavy stone, Mason hurled it into the dense brush on the opposite side of the creek. It crashed through branches with a sound distinct from the ambient storm noise. Both men jerked toward the disturbance, Mitchell drawing a sidearm Mason hadn't noticed before. "What was that?" Mitchell hissed. "Wildlife, probably," the European replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "Finish collecting these samples. We're leaving in 5 minutes." From the ridge, Mason could see Ryan steadily photographing the scene, his phone's camera occasionally emitting a faint flash despite the night mode setting. One such flash caught Mitchell's attention. The wildlife officer squinted toward the ridge, then raised his weapon. "Someone's up there," he said sharply. "We're being watched." Mason didn't hesitate. He grabbed another stone and hurled it directly into the creek near the men, creating a loud splash that sent both of them scrambling backward. In the ensuing confusion, he whistled sharply, the signal for Ryan to retreat. The European man swung his lantern toward the sound, its beam cutting through the rain, but finding only empty forest. "We need to go. Now." They hastily gathered their equipment, abandoning the half-filled soil sample bags in their rush. As they retreated toward what Mason presumed was their vehicle, he made his way back to the rendezvous point. Ryan was already there, breathing hard but grinning. "Got them." Clear shots of both faces, the equipment, everything. Mitchell's badge is clearly visible in several frames. "Good work," Mason said. "Let's get back to Alexander's before they realize what happened." As they drove carefully back through the forest, Ryan flipped through the photos on his phone. "This proves Victoria is violating the injunction. Mitchell could lose his job for this." "It's more than that," Mason replied grimly. "It proves she's actively searching for the mineral documentation, which confirms she knows about its existence and value. That undermines her entire claim that she was only interested in conservation." They were nearing the main road when headlights appeared in their rearview mirror, approaching rapidly from the direction of the ranch. "That's them," Ryan said, tension evident in his voice. "They must have heard us leaving." Mason accelerated, but the pursuing vehicle gained ground quickly. As it drew closer, Mason could see it was a black SUV with roof-mounted spotlights, official county wildlife service equipment. "Mitchell's trying to stop us," he realized. "He knows we have evidence against him." The SUV pulled alongside them, its spotlight blinding as it shone directly into their vehicle. The driver, the European man, gestured for them to pull over. When Mason didn't comply, the SUV swerved toward them, forcing them toward the shoulder. "Hold on," Mason warned, then executed a hard brake turn he'd learned during evasive driving training in the military. The SUV shot past them, unable to match the maneuver on the slick road. By the time the larger vehicle had turned around, Mason had already accelerated onto the main highway toward Durango. "They won't try anything on the main road," he assured Ryan, who was gripping the dashboard with white knuckles. "Too many potential witnesses." His prediction proved correct. The SUV maintained a distance of several hundred yards behind them, but made no further aggressive moves as they approached the town limits. When Mason turned toward Alexander's office, the pursuing vehicle continued straight, disappearing into the night. Alexander was waiting anxiously when they arrived, Luna pacing restlessly beside him in the courtyard. "What happened? You look like you've been through a war zone." "Not far from it," Mason said, showing him the mud coating his clothes. "Mitchell and some European operative were digging up the creek bed, looking for Hannah's documents and soil samples." Ryan held up his phone. "We got evidence. Clear photos of both of them trespassing, using geological survey equipment. The works." Alexander's expression shifted from concern to determined focus. "This changes our approach. We can file for sanctions against Victoria for violating the injunction and report Mitchell for abusing his official position." "It gets worse," Mason added. "When they realized we were watching, they tried to run us off the road." "Assault with a deadly weapon," Alexander muttered, making notes. "We need to transfer those photos immediately before anything happens to the phone." As they moved into the office, Mason's own phone rang, his mother's number flashing on the screen. He answered immediately. "Mason." Her voice was tense but excited. "I found it. Your grandfather's will from 1978 specifically mentions the mineral extraction rights to the former Kavanaugh Morgan property as being passed to your father, James Reed. And I have the original deed separation document from 1932 with the notarized mineral rights reservation." Relief flooded through Mason. "That's exactly what we need. Can you scan and email these tonight?" "Already done. I sent everything to the address you texted earlier." "But Mason," she hesitated. "There's something else." Something about Hannah Morgan's grandfather and ours. I found letters between them from after the Depression. Thomas Morgan could have claimed the mineral rights through legal technicalities, but he refused. He wrote that a handshake between honest men meant more than any courthouse paper. The revelation struck Mason deeply. Two families honoring an agreement through generations despite the potential wealth at stake. It made Victoria's manipulation of Hannah in her final days even more despicable. "Mom," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Thank you. This means more than you know. I wish your father could see you fighting for our family's legacy," she replied softly. "He always said you had his stubbornness." After hanging up, Mason found Alexander already reviewing the emailed documents on his computer, his expression growing increasingly confident. "This is exceptional," the lawyer said, pointing to specific passages in the will. "Your grandfather explicitly acknowledges the mineral rights as a distinct asset from any land ownership. And here, he notes their potential future value and the importance of maintaining the family's claim. It's exactly the kind of continuous recognition we need to defeat an abandonment argument." Luna had settled near Mason's feet, her warm presence a strange comfort after the tension of the night. She seemed to sense the shift in mood, her eyes half closed but alert. "So what happens now?" Ryan asked. "Now," Alexander said, his voice taking on the sharp confidence of a lawyer who knows he has the winning hand, "we prepare for Monday. Victoria will be expecting us to focus solely on the property dispute in Luna's custody. She won't be prepared for us to present a comprehensive mineral rights claim backed by a century of documentation." Mason nodded, feeling for the first time since arriving in Durango that they might actually prevail. "And Mitchell's illegal activities? I'll file a formal complaint with the sheriff's department tomorrow morning. With Ryan's photographs as evidence, they'll have no choice but to open an investigation." Alexander's expression hardened. Victoria's network of influence may be extensive, but even she can't easily explain away armed men conducting illegal geological surveys in the middle of the night. Outside, the storm had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the valley. Mason thought of the ranch house standing empty in the darkness, of Hannah's hidden metal box now safely in Alexander's office, of the creek where two children had once carved their initials into stone with no idea of the wealth beneath their feet. "Hannah knew what would happen," he said quietly. "She knew Victoria would come after the minerals when she was gone. That's why she arranged for me to get the ranch, because she trusted our family's history more than any legal document Victoria could force her to sign." Ryan nodded, his expression solemn. Hannah was always thinking 3 steps ahead. Even when she was a kid, she could see connections others missed. Luna stood suddenly, moving to the window with her ears perked forward, muscles tense beneath her spotted coat. A moment later, they heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. Alexander moved cautiously to peek through the blinds. "County Sheriff's cruiser," he reported. "Single officer." Mason joined him at the window, recognizing the tall figure emerging from the patrol car. "That's Sheriff Donovan. I met him years ago before I enlisted. He was friends with my father." The sheriff approached the office door with deliberate steps, rain plastering his uniform to his broad shoulders. Alexander let him in, the older man removing his hat as he entered, revealing steel-gray hair and a deeply lined face. "Reed," he said, nodding to Mason, "thought I might find you here. Got a call about a disturbance out near the Morgan property. Wildlife Service vehicle involved." "Sheriff," Mason acknowledged, "we were just about to contact your office about that very incident." Sheriff Donovan's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, moved from Mason to Ryan to the documents spread across Alexander's desk. Then his gaze fell on Luna, who had retreated to a corner but watched the newcomer with intense focus. "So that's the Bobcat everyone's talking about," he said quietly. "Doesn't look like the public menace Mitchell described in his report." "She's not," Mason confirmed. "She was raised here by Hannah Morgan. She's no danger to anyone who doesn't threaten her." The sheriff considered this, then turned his attention back to Mason. "Mitchell claims you and Morgan here were trespassing on restricted conservation land, interfering with official wildlife management operations." Ryan made a sound of disbelief. "That's completely backwards. We have photographic evidence of Mitchell conducting illegal excavations on private property, in direct violation of a court injunction." Alexander stepped forward, his professional demeanor firmly in place. Sheriff, my client purchased the Morgan Ranch legally. We have filed for an emergency injunction preventing any alteration of the property pending a hearing on Monday. Mitchell was trespassing, along with an unidentified foreign national, conducting unauthorized geological surveys. Sheriff Donovan's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, perhaps, or concern. Geological surveys. What exactly is going on here, counselor? Alexander glanced at Mason, who nodded permission to proceed. The Morgan Ranch sits on a significant deposit of rare earth minerals, Alexander explained. Victoria Stone, acting as executor of Hannah Morgan's estate, appears to be working with Heartland Resource Development to secure mining rights to these minerals, potentially worth millions. And my family has owned the mineral rights separately from the land since 1932, Mason added. Hannah knew this and left documentation for me to find. The sheriff absorbed this information silently, then turned to Ryan. These photographs Mitchell's so concerned about. May I see them? Ryan handed over his phone. Sheriff Donovan scrolled through the images methodically, his expression darkening with each swipe of his finger. This isn't wildlife management, he said finally, his voice hard. And that man with Mitchell isn't county personnel. I know every officer and employee in our jurisdiction. We believe he works for Highland Resource Development, or possibly directly for Victoria Stone, Alexander suggested. The sheriff handed the phone back to Ryan. I'm going to need formal statements from both of you and copies of these photographs. Mitchell's overstepped badly here, and I aim to find out who authorized it. As Ryan began transferring the photos to the sheriff's department email, Donovan moved closer to Mason. Your father was a good man, he said quietly. He talked about those mineral rights sometimes. Said they were the family's safety net if times got truly desperate. Never wanted to use them, though. Felt the land was more valuable undisturbed. You knew about this? Mason asked, surprised. Small towns have long memories, son, and your family and the Morgans go back generations in this valley. The sheriff's eyes moved to Luna, who had relaxed slightly, sensing perhaps that the newcomer posed no threat. Hannah loved that cat, like family. Fought the county for years to keep her. If she wanted you to have guardianship of Luna, that carries weight with me. After taking their formal statements, Sheriff Donovan prepared to leave. At the door, he turned back. I'll post a deputy at the ranch tonight, and another here. Mitchell and his friend crossed a line with that road incident. Until this is resolved, consider yourselves under department protection. When the sheriff had gone, the three men sat in exhausted silence for several minutes. Luna had finally settled on a blanket Alexander had provided, her golden eyes drifting closed as the tension of the evening dissipated. We should try to get some sleep, Alexander finally suggested. Tomorrow we need to organize all this evidence and prepare for Monday's hearing. As Ryan made himself comfortable on Alexander's office couch, Mason stretched out in a recliner near Luna's blanket. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. His mind kept returning to Hannah's letter, to the revelation of their childhood connection, to the promise he had made and forgotten while she had remembered and preserved. In the darkness, Luna's eyes glinted as she watched him, her presence a strange comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. Mason reached out, resting his hand near enough for her to sense without feeling crowded. To his surprise, she shifted closer until her warm flank pressed against his fingertips. We'll protect your home, he whispered. I promise, Wifey. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the windows. Mason finally drifted into sleep with Luna's rhythmic breathing beside him, dreaming of creek beds and carved stones, of mineral wealth hidden beneath childhood promises, and of a young girl with auburn hair who had never forgotten him, even when he had forgotten himself. Morning arrived with thin beams of sunlight cutting through the blinds of Alexander's office. Mason woke with a start, momentarily disoriented until he registered Luna's warm presence still pressed against his side. The Bobcat was awake, her amber eyes alert but calm as she observed the stirring humans around her. Ryan was already up, hunched over his phone at Alexander's desk. The lawyer himself emerged from a small back room, freshly showered and dressed in what were clearly court clothes, a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. Thought I'd get ready early, Alexander explained, catching Mason's questioning look. The hearing isn't until tomorrow, but I've scheduled an emergency conference with Judge Miriam Lawson this afternoon. Given the evidence of Mitchell's illegal activities, we might be able to secure additional protections before the formal hearing. Mason nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Any news from the sheriff? Donovan called an hour ago, Ryan answered, looking up from his phone. They questioned Mitchell this morning. He's claiming he was conducting a legitimate wildlife habitat assessment, but he couldn't explain the survey equipment or his companion, who seems to have disappeared. Convenient, Mason muttered. The sheriff also checked on the ranch, Alexander added. Everything appears undisturbed, though he noted fresh tire tracks on the logging road, consistent with your account of last night's encounter. Mason stood, stretching muscles stiff from a night in the recliner. Luna rose as well, arching her back in a stretch that mirrored his own with uncanny similarity. The parallel wasn't lost on Ryan, who smiled faintly. Hannah used to say you two were kindred spirits, he commented. Seems she was right. A knock at the office door interrupted any response Mason might have made. Alexander moved cautiously to answer it, relaxing when he saw a uniformed deputy through the peephole. The deputy, a young woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded briskly as she entered. Sheriff Donovan sent me to update you and provide escort if needed. We've issued a citation to Officer Mitchell for trespassing and unauthorized use of county equipment. The sheriff is personally reviewing all wildlife service operations involving the Morgan property. Any sign of Victoria Stone? Alexander asked. None directly, but there's activity at the Conservation Trust office. Emergency board meeting scheduled for noon. Mason and Alexander exchanged concerned glances. Victoria was moving quickly, mobilizing whatever administrative leverage she still possessed. We need to prepare for the judge, Alexander said, and I want to get these documents filed with the court clerk before Victoria can make any more moves. The deputy nodded. I'm instructed to provide security for Mr. Reed and the Bobcat, as well as escort for any court filings. Sheriff's taking this seriously. Alexander gathered the critical documents, the original mineral rights deed, the family wills establishing continuity of ownership, Hannah's notarized statement, and the evidence of Mitchell's trespassing into a leather portfolio. Ryan, can you stay here with Luna? Mason asked. I don't want to risk bringing her into town with Victoria potentially looking for any advantage. Ryan agreed readily. She knows me. We'll be fine. With the deputy following in her cruiser, Mason and Alexander drove to the courthouse, a sandstone building with high windows and worn marble steps. Inside, the air carried the hushed solemnity particular to places where life-altering decisions were made daily. The court clerk, an efficient woman in her 50s with reading glasses perched on her nose, accepted Alexander's filings with professional neutrality. Judge Lawson will see you at 2 o'clock, she informed them. Ms. Stone's attorney has also requested to be present. Who's representing her? Alexander asked, a note of wariness in his voice. William Prescott, the clerk replied, and Mason didn't miss the slight tightening of Alexander's jaw at the name. Problem? Mason asked quietly as they moved away from the clerk's desk. Prescott is a corporate attorney from Denver, Alexander explained, specializes in natural resource cases. He doesn't come cheap, and he doesn't lose often. Victoria's pulling out all the stops. They had a few hours before the conference with Judge Lawson, so they retreated to a small cafe across from the courthouse. Over strong coffee and sandwiches, Alexander outlined their strategy. We have 3 separate but related issues, he explained, laying out notes on the table. First, your legal ownership of the ranch itself, which Victoria is contesting based on improper transfer procedures. Second, Luna's guardianship, which the wildlife authorities are challenging on permit grounds. Third, and most valuable, the mineral rights ownership, which fundamentally changes the entire equation. How so? If we can establish your family's continuous ownership of the mineral rights, it undermines Victoria's entire narrative about conservation. It exposes her true motive, gaining control of those minerals through highland resource development. That damages her credibility on all other claims. Mason nodded, understanding the approach. What about Mitchell's activities last night? That's our ace, Alexander said, lowering his voice. Proof of bad faith actions, violation of a court order, and potentially criminal behavior by Victoria's agents. We won't lead with it, but we'll have it ready if Prescott tries to paint this as a simple property dispute. After lunch, they returned to the courthouse, where the deputy was waiting to escort them to Judge Lawson's chambers. William Prescott was already there, a tall, silver-haired man in an impeccable suit that probably cost more than Mason's truck. He acknowledged them with a curt nod, but offered no handshake. Judge Miriam Lawson was a woman in her early 60s with clear, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suited her position. Her chambers were organized with meticulous precision, law books arranged by subject and color on built-in shelves behind her substantial desk. Gentlemen, she began without preamble, this is not a formal hearing, but an opportunity to address immediate concerns before tomorrow's proceedings. I've reviewed the emergency filings from both parties, and frankly, I'm troubled by several aspects of this case. She turned to Alexander. Counselor Hayes, you've alleged illegal activities by county officials on the disputed property last night. That's a serious accusation. We have photographic evidence, Your Honor, Alexander replied, presenting printed copies of Ryan's photos. And Sheriff Donovan has already issued citations for trespassing and misuse of county equipment. Judge Lawson examined the photos carefully, her expression hardening. Mr. Prescott, are you aware of these activities? The corporate lawyer maintained his composure. My client categorically denies authorizing any such actions, Your Honor. If Officer Mitchell was present on the property, it would have been in his official capacity regarding the Bobcat situation. With geological survey equipment? The judge asked sharply. At midnight, in a rainstorm? Prescott's smile remained fixed, but his eyes flickered with annoyance. Ms. Stone cannot be held responsible for Officer Mitchell's methods or timing. As executor of the Morgan estate, her sole concern is ensuring proper management of conservation trust lands and the humane treatment of wildlife. Judge Lawson set the photos aside. Let's address the fundamental issues. Mr. Prescott, your client contends that Mr. Reed's purchase of the Morgan Ranch was invalid due to improper transfer procedures. Yet the deed appears properly executed by a licensed real estate agent. Walter Graves had no authority to sell trust property, Your Honor, Prescott countered smoothly. The Morgan Ranch was designated for conservation management in Hannah Morgan's legal will, with Ms. Stone as executor. Mr. Graves acted without consulting the executor or the trust board. Alexander leaned forward. Your Honor, we contend that Hannah Morgan's official will was executed under duress when she was gravely ill. We've discovered an earlier, unsigned will that clearly indicates her intention to leave the property to Mr. Reed, along with guardianship of the Bobcat known as Luna. Unsigned documents have little legal weight, Counselor, Judge Lawson noted. True, Your Honor, but they establish a pattern when considered alongside Ms. Morgan's other actions, specifically her deliberate preservation of evidence regarding the mineral rights ownership. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. Alexander carefully presented the mineral rights documentation, explaining the historical separation of surface and subsurface rights dating back to the Depression era. As these documents demonstrate, Your Honor, the Kavanaugh-Reed family has maintained continuous ownership of the mineral rights to this property for nearly a century, despite changes in the surface land ownership. Hannah Morgan was aware of this fact and acknowledged it in her notarized statement. Prescott's expression remained controlled, but Mason noticed a slight tightening around his eyes as he examined the documents. This was clearly not a development Victoria had prepared him for. These alleged mineral rights are irrelevant to the current dispute, Prescott argued. We're addressing the valid transfer of surface property and wildlife management issues. On the contrary, Alexander countered, they're central to understanding Ms. Stone's motives. The Morgan Ranch sits atop valuable rare earth mineral deposits, which Highland Resource Development has been actively prospecting. Ms. Stone serves as legal counsel to Highland, a fact she concealed while inserting herself into Hannah Morgan's affairs during her terminal illness. Judge Lawson's eyebrows rose. Is this allegation substantiated? Alexander produced corporate filings showing Victoria listed as outside counsel for Highland, along with emails from Hannah's computer documenting Victoria's increasing pressure regarding property decisions. Your Honor, Prescott interjected, even if these mineral claims were valid, which we dispute, they have no bearing on the legitimate conservation concerns regarding this property. The Bobcat situation alone justifies immediate action. Regarding Luna, Alexander responded, Hannah Morgan held all proper rehabilitation permits for the animal's care. Mr. Reed is prepared to apply for transfer of those permits and has demonstrated appropriate caretaking abilities. The judge considered this, then addressed Mason directly. Mr. Reed, you have military experience, correct? Yes, Your Honor. 3 tours in Afghanistan. And you believe you're qualified to care for a wild predator? Mason met her gaze steadily. Luna was raised by Hannah Morgan from a kit. She's accustomed to human presence and has shown no aggression except when threatened. I've established trust with her in a remarkably short time, which wildlife experts will tell you is unusual unless the animal recognizes something familiar and safe. He hesitated, then continued. Hannah and I were childhood friends, Your Honor. We made a promise about this land when we were young, a promise I forgot, but she remembered. Luna seems to remember too in her way. Judge Lawson studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the documents. These are complex issues that warrant full consideration at tomorrow's hearing. In the meantime, I'm issuing temporary orders to maintain the status quo. She fixed Prescott with a stern look. No wildlife officers are to enter the property without court authorization. The Bobcat remains in Mr. Reed's custody pending proper evaluation by independent wildlife experts, not county officials who have already demonstrated questionable judgment. Prescott began to protest, but the judge cut him off. Additionally, I'm extending the injunction against any alteration of the property, including geological assessments or sample collection, until ownership is fully determined. She gathered the papers before her. I'll review these mineral rights documents carefully before tomorrow's hearing. If they're authentic, they significantly alter the context of this dispute. Her gaze shifted between the two attorneys. Gentlemen, I expect full disclosure of all relevant facts tomorrow. This court does not look kindly on hidden agendas or conflicts of interest. As they left the judge's chambers, Prescott fell into step beside Mason, speaking quietly enough that only he could hear. Victoria authorized me to offer $100,000 for you to walk away. That's 10,000 times your investment, Reed. Take it and forget about this mess. Mason didn't break stride. Not interested. 200,000 then, final offer. It's not about money. Prescott's professional veneer slipped slightly, revealing a flash of frustration. Don't be a fool. Victoria Stone doesn't lose, especially not to sentimentality over a rundown ranch and a wild animal. Then this will be a new experience for her, Mason replied evenly, continuing toward the exit without looking back. Outside, Alexander was unable to suppress a small smile. Prescott was rattled. The mineral rights documentation caught them completely off guard. Victoria's raising her buyout offer, Mason told him. 200,000 now. Alexander's eyebrows rose. That's still far below the potential value, but it shows she's worried. The judge clearly has concerns about Victoria's role in all this. They returned to Alexander's office to find Ryan and Luna exactly as they'd left them. Ryan reading a book in the courtyard while Luna dozed in a patch of afternoon sun. The Bobcat raised her head at their approach, her amber eyes finding Mason immediately. How'd it go? Ryan asked, marking his place in the book. Better than expected, Alexander replied. Judge Lawson seemed skeptical of Victoria's conservation claims, especially after seeing the evidence of Mitchell's nighttime activities. And she's extended the protection order for Luna, Mason added, crouching to greet the Bobcat, who stretched and patted over to him. No wildlife officers can approach her without court approval. Ryan smiled. That's something, at least. Alexander was checking his phone, frowning at a message. Nathan Daniels from the assessor's office just texted, Victoria's called an emergency vote of the Conservation Trust Board. They're meeting right now. Can they override the judge's orders? Mason asked. Not legally, but they could create complications for tomorrow's hearing. Alexander pocketed his phone. I need to prepare our final arguments. Ryan, can you take Mason and Luna back to the ranch? The deputy will follow you. I think it's safe now with the sheriff's department involved and the judge's orders in place. The drive back to the Morgan Ranch was quiet, both men lost in thought about the next day's hearing. The deputy's cruiser followed at a discreet distance, a reassuring presence given recent events. As they turned onto the ranch's long driveway, Mason noticed something different. Eleanor Parker's old station wagon parked near the porch, the elderly woman herself sitting in a rocking chair with a shotgun across her lap. Well, there's a sight, Ryan murmured as they pulled up. Eleanor watched impassively as they exited the vehicle, her weathered hands steady on the shotgun. Only when Luna emerged from her crate in the back seat did the old woman's expression soften. Thought you might need a little extra security? she called by way of greeting. Sheriff's deputies can't be everywhere at once. Mason approached her with genuine appreciation. Thank you, Eleanor. Have there been any problems? Just some city folk in a black SUV driving past real slow this morning. Turned around when they saw me sitting here. She patted the shotgun. This old Winchester tends to discourage trespassers. Ryan helped Mason unload supplies from the truck. Food, water, and bedding for both human and Bobcat. Luna immediately disappeared inside the house, as if checking that everything was still in its proper place. Eleanor declined their invitation to come inside, insisting she was comfortable on the porch. Been watching over this place on and off for months, she explained. Feels right to be here now, at the end. You think tomorrow will be the end? Mason asked. The old woman's eyes, sharp despite her years, studied him. One way or another, either Hannah's wishes get honored or Victoria Stone gets what she's been after all along. And what do you think that is? Eleanor snorted softly. Money, of course. It's always money with people like her. This land's been coveted before, you know. Back in the 80s, there was talk of a mining operation. Hannah's grandfather shut it down. Said some things were worth more than what you could dig out of the ground. Mason nodded, thinking of the letters his mother had discovered between their grandfathers. The Morgan and Kavanaugh families seemed to have understood each other. Good people usually do, Eleanor replied simply. Inside, Mason found Luna inspecting every corner of the house, as if cataloging any changes since their departure. The Bobcat seemed more relaxed here than at Alexander's office, moving with the confidence of familiar territory. Ryan helped Mason secure the windows and doors, a precaution that felt necessary despite the deputy's presence outside. As evening approached, Eleanor finally agreed to come inside, though she positioned her rocking chair near the front window, shotgun still within reach. Victoria won't give up easily, she observed as Mason prepared a simple dinner for everyone. That woman's built her whole career on never backing down. Well, and Alexander thinks we have a strong case with the mineral rights documentation, Mason replied, setting plates on the kitchen table. Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee with a grateful nod. Maybe so, but court cases aren't just about documents. They're about who tells the better story. Her gaze drifted to Luna, who had settled near the wood stove. And sometimes they're about who has the most to lose. After dinner, Ryan excused himself to make phone calls outside, leaving Mason and Eleanor in companionable silence broken only by the occasional pop from the wood stove. You don't remember her at all, do you? Eleanor asked suddenly. Hannah. Mason hesitated. Fragments. A girl with auburn hair. The creek where we carved our initials, but not clear memories. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. You were young, and boys that age don't pay much attention to the quieter things. She set her coffee cup down. Hannah remembered everything. She could describe the exact day you two made that promise about the ranch, right down to what you were wearing and how the clouds looked that afternoon. I wish I'd known, Mason said softly, that she was here, that she remembered. She knew you had your own path to follow, Eleanor replied, but she always believed you'd come back someday. The old woman's eyes, faded blue but still keen, held his. She said some connections don't break, no matter how far apart people grow. Before Mason could respond, Ryan burst through the door, his expression urgent. Just got word from a friend on the conservation board. Victoria pushed through an emergency resolution authorizing immediate protective intervention for Luna, effective at midnight tonight. What does that mean? Mason demanded. It means they're claiming authority to seize Luna immediately, regardless of the judge's temporary order. They're arguing that the court's jurisdiction applies to the property dispute, but not to wildlife management decisions. Eleanor rose to her feet with surprising speed for her age. That's nonsense. The judge specifically prohibited wildlife officers from entering the property. They're not sending Mitchell, Ryan explained grimly. They've contracted with a private wildlife management company, completely separate from the county service. Victoria's found a loophole. Mason felt a cold anger spreading through his chest. When are they coming? My source says they've been instructed to wait until after midnight, when there's less chance of public attention or interference. Mason glanced at Luna, who had raised her head at the tension in the room, her amber eyes alert with that uncanny perceptiveness Hannah had always attributed to her. We need to call Alexander, Mason decided, reaching for his phone. The lawyer answered it immediately. his voice sharp with concern as Mason explained the situation. It's a legally dubious move, Alexander said after considering the implications. But by the time we get an emergency ruling to stop it, they could already have Luna. Victoria's counting on creating a fait accompli before the judge can intervene. What do we do? Mason asked, watching as Luna rose and moved closer to him, sensing his distress. I'll call Judge Lawson directly and request an emergency clarification of her order, Alexander promised. But we need to buy time. Is the deputy still there? Mason checked through the window. Yes, parked at the end of the driveway. Good. Inform her of the situation. Her presence might deter them, at least until I can reach the judge. After hanging up, Mason briefed the deputy, who immediately called for backup, but warned it might take time for additional officers to reach the remote ranch. What Victoria's attempting walks a fine line between aggressive legal maneuvering and outright contempt of court, the deputy explained. But without explicit clarification from Judge Lawson, I can't prevent them from executing what they'll claim is a legitimate wildlife management action. As darkness fell, the atmosphere in the old ranch house grew increasingly tense. Ryan stationed himself at the back window, watching the property line where the logging road emerged from the forest. Eleanor remained near the front, her shotgun loaded, but safely pointed away from anyone. Luna seemed to absorb their anxiety, pacing between rooms with increasing restlessness. Mason tried to soothe her, speaking in the quiet, steady tone that had earned her trust from the beginning. But even he could sense the fragility of their situation. Shortly after 11, Alexander called with mixed news. I reached Judge Lawson. She's furious about Victoria's end run and around her order. But legally, the situation is complex. She's drafting an emergency clarification explicitly prohibiting any removal of Luna by any entity, public or private, pending tomorrow's hearing. Will it arrive in time? Mason asked. That's the problem. It needs to be properly filed and served to be legally binding. I'm working with the court clerk, but we're looking at a few hours at minimum. Too long, Mason thought, glancing at the clock. We'll have to hold them off ourselves. Mason, Alexander's voice sharpened, don't do anything that could jeopardize our case. If they come with what appears to be legal authorization, physical resistance could be construed as obstruction. I understand, Mason replied, though his mind was already calculating alternatives. After hanging up, he turned to Ryan and Eleanor. We need to move Luna somewhere safe until Alexander gets the judge's clarification. Where? Ryan asked. They'll be watching all roads out of here. Mason considered their options. The ranch covered 82 acres with numerous potential hiding places, but most would be vulnerable to systematic search, especially if the wildlife team brought tracking equipment. Then he remembered Hannah's letter. Look beneath the stones where we carved our initials. The creek, he said suddenly. There's a natural cave formation behind the waterfall. Hannah and I used it as a hideout when we were kids. The memory surfaced clearly now, a narrow opening behind the cascading water leading to a dry chamber in the limestone. Can we get there without being seen from the main road? Ryan asked. Mason nodded. There's a deer trail that runs along the ridge. It's nearly invisible unless you know it's there. Eleanor rose stiffly from her chair. You two take Luna. I'll stay here and keep them occupied if they arrive before you're safely hidden. Eleanor, Mason began, but the old woman cut him off with a wave of her hand. I've known Victoria Stone's type my whole life, she said firmly. Corporate bullies who think money trumps everything else. They won't lay a hand on an old woman with a shotgun and a deputy standing witness. Ryan checked his watch. It's nearly 11:30. We should move now before they get into position. Mason gathered minimal supplies, water, a flashlight, a thermal blanket, and Luna's familiar blanket from beside the wood stove. The Bobcat watched these preparations with obvious interest, as if understanding the urgency behind them. Stay with me, Mason told her quietly, holding her gaze. Just like we did at the creek yesterday, quiet and careful. To his relief, Luna seemed to comprehend, following closely as they slipped out the back door into the crisp night air. The nearly full moon cast enough light to navigate by, though they kept to the shadows where possible. Ryan led the way, with Mason and Luna following single file along the narrow ridge trail. Below them, the ranch house lights glowed softly in the darkness, Eleanor's silhouette visible in the window as she maintained her vigil. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the creek when the distant sound of vehicles reached them, engines rumbling along the main road leading to the ranch. "They're early," Ryan whispered, pausing to listen. "Keep moving," Mason urged. "We need to reach the cave before they start searching the property." They increased their pace, though the trail grew increasingly treacherous in the darkness. Luna moved with the natural grace of a wild predator, easily navigating the rough terrain, occasionally pausing to look back at Mason as if ensuring he was still following. The sound of the creek reached them before they could see it, water tumbling over rocks in the quiet night. As they descended toward the stream bed, the moonlight revealed a small waterfall cascading into a clear pool, surrounded by the limestone formations where Mason and Hannah had carved their initials so many years ago. Mason approached the fall, feeling along the slick rock face beside the rushing water. The opening was narrower than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply larger than the boy who had last used this hideaway. But it was still there, a dark crevice just wide enough for a man to slip through sideways. "Luna, come," he called softly, and the bobcat approached cautiously, sniffing at the water's edge. Ryan looked doubtful. "Will she go in there? It's dark and wet. Not exactly ideal cat territory." "She trusts me," Mason replied, hoping his confidence wasn't misplaced. He slipped through the opening, finding himself in the small chamber beyond, exactly as he remembered it. The sound of the waterfall was muffled here, the space dry and protected from the elements. He called to Luna, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. For a moment, nothing happened, and Mason felt a surge of concern that the bobcat might balk at entering such an unnatural environment. Then Luna's sleek form appeared in the narrow opening, her amber eyes reflecting the beam of Mason's flashlight. She hesitated only briefly before slipping inside, shaking water droplets from her fur as she explored the small cave. "She's in," Mason called to Ryan, who remained outside. "I'll head back to the house," Ryan replied. "Better if I'm there when they arrive. Less suspicious than all of us being gone." "Be careful," Mason warned. "You too. I'll signal when it's safe to return." As Ryan's footsteps faded, Mason settled on the cave floor, spreading Luna's blanket in the driest corner. The bobcat completed her inspection of their shelter, then surprised him by settling directly beside him, her warm body pressed against his leg as if seeking reassurance. "It's going to be okay," he told her, gently stroking the coarse fur behind her ears. "We just need to stay here until morning. Then the judge will make everything right." Luna's purring vibrated against his side, a sound he'd never heard from her before. In the confined space of the cave, with only the muffled sound of falling water and Luna's steady breathing for company, Mason felt a profound connection to this place, to Hannah's memory, and to the wild creature who had somehow recognized him when he could barely remember himself. Outside, somewhere on the property, Victoria's hired wildlife team would be arriving, armed with tranquilizer guns and transport cages. But here, hidden in a secret place known only to two children from long ago, Mason and Luna waited in safety for justice to finally arrive with the morning light. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge in bands of gold and violet, its light filtering through the thin curtain of water that concealed the cave entrance. Mason had dozed fitfully through the night, waking at every unusual sound, one hand resting protectively on Luna's flank. The bobcat had remained remarkably calm in their limestone shelter, occasionally rising to stretch or investigate small noises before returning to Mason's side. His watch showed 6:17 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock, but they'd received no signal from Ryan that it was safe to emerge. Mason's phone had lost reception in the cave, leaving them isolated from updates. Luna stirred beside him, her ears swiveling toward the cave entrance. A moment later, Mason heard it too, footsteps approaching the waterfall, deliberately slow but not particularly stealthy. "Mason?" Ryan's voice called softly. "Are you in there? It's safe now." Mason hesitated, years of combat wariness making him cautious. "What was your mother's name?" he called back, testing with a question only the real Ryan would know. "Sarah," came the immediate response. "She made the best apple pie in 3 counties, according to Hannah." Relieved, Mason gathered their few supplies while Luna watched the entrance intently. He slipped through the narrow opening first, scanning the creek bank before signaling Luna to follow. The bobcat emerged with a graceful leap, shaking water droplets from her coat as she landed on dry stone. Ryan stood a few yards away, looking exhausted but triumphant. "You wouldn't believe the night we've had," he said. "What happened?" Mason asked, falling into step beside him as they began the trek back to the ranch. Victoria's team arrived just after midnight. Two men in a white van with Highland Resource Development logos partially covered with magnetic wildlife management signs. Pretty amateur operation, actually. Ryan grinned. Eleanor was magnificent, sitting there on the porch with her shotgun across her knees, telling them they were trespassing on private property under court protection. They didn't try to force their way in. They might have, but Sheriff Donovan arrived with two deputies right as things were getting tense. Seems Alexander reached Judge Lawson, who called the sheriff directly. Donovan informed Victoria's men that they were potentially in contempt of court and would be arrested if they attempted to enter the property. How did Victoria react? Ryan's grin widened. That's the best part. She showed up around 2 a.m. absolutely furious, started threatening everyone with lawsuits. The sheriff, the deputies, even Eleanor. Then Judge Lawson herself appeared. Mason stopped in surprise. The judge came here, in the middle of the night, drove straight from her home after signing the emergency clarification order, said she wanted to personally ensure her court wasn't being disrespected. Ryan shook his head in admiration. You should have seen Victoria's face when the judge handed her the order and informed her that any further attempts to circumvent the court's authority would result in sanctions and potential disbarment proceedings. As they crested the ridge, the ranch house came into view below. Two sheriff's vehicles remained parked in the yard, along with Eleanor's station wagon and a silver sedan Mason didn't recognize. Judge Lawson is still here, Ryan explained, following his gaze. She wanted to speak with you before the formal hearing. Luna had moved ahead of them on the trail, her pace quickening as they approached familiar territory. By the time Mason and Ryan reached the yard, she was already on the porch where Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, shotgun now propped safely against the wall. There she is, the old woman called, relief evident in her voice. Safe and sound, just like I told the judge. Inside, Judge Lawson sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, her formal black robes replaced by a simple blouse and slacks. She rose when Mason entered, her keen eyes taking in his disheveled appearance and the bobcat that padded in beside him. Mr. Reed, she greeted him, I apologize for the unusual circumstances, but I felt it important to see this situation firsthand before making my final ruling. I appreciate your coming, Your Honor, Mason replied, acutely aware of his rumpled clothes and unshaven face. The judge's gaze shifted to Luna, who had settled near the wood stove in her usual spot, seemingly unperturbed by the night in the cave or the presence of strangers in the house. So this is the controversial Bobcat, she observed. Hardly seems like the dangerous predator Officer Mitchell described in his reports. Luna was raised by Hannah from a kit, Mason explained. She's accustomed to human presence, especially in this house. Well, Judge Lawson nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Parker has been filling me in on the history here, both the recent events and the longer connection between your families. She gestured to the chair across from her. Please sit. I have a few questions before we proceed to the formal hearing. Mason complied, noting that Ryan had tactfully withdrawn to the porch with Eleanor, giving them privacy. Mr. Reed, the judge began, her tone conversational rather than judicial, I've reviewed the mineral rights documentation your attorney submitted, along with the evidence of Ms. Stone's connections to Highland Resource Development. The legal case appears relatively straightforward on those fronts. She paused, studying him intently. What I'm less clear about is your personal investment in this matter. I'm not sure I understand, Your Honor. You purchased this property for $10 less than a week ago, having been away from Durango for many years. Now you're fighting a sophisticated legal battle against a powerful corporate attorney over a rundown ranch and a semi-wild bobcat. Her expression remained neutral. Most people would have taken Ms. Stone's settlement offer and walked away. $200,000 is substantial compensation for such a brief investment. Mason considered his response carefully. When I signed in those purchase papers, I thought I was just buying land, somewhere quiet to figure out what comes next after the military. I didn't remember Hannah or our childhood promise about this place. And now I understand that Hannah never forgot. She protected this land, and Luna, believing I would return someday. He met the judge's gaze directly. Taking Victoria's money would dishonor that faith, and it would mean abandoning Luna to whatever fate Victoria arranged for her. Judge Lawson nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. And the mineral rights? They represent potential wealth far beyond Victoria's offer. They're part of my family's legacy, Mason acknowledged. But that's not why I'm fighting to protect them. Hannah could have challenged those rights during her lifetime. According to the letters our grandparents exchanged, her family knew about them for generations, but honored the original agreement. That kind of integrity matters. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly. In my experience, Mr. Reed, such principles are increasingly rare, particularly when millions of dollars are at stake. She rose, gathering her belongings. I won't prejudge the case we'll hear formally in a few hours, but I will say that seeing this property, meeting Mrs. Parker, and observing Luna's behavior has provided valuable context. Her gaze lingered on the Bobcat, who was watching their interaction with evident interest. Some things can't be adequately conveyed through legal briefs and affidavits. Thank you for taking the time to see for yourself, Your Honor, Mason said, standing as she prepared to leave. Judge Lawson paused at the door. One last question, Mr. Reed. If you prevail today, what are your intentions for this property and the mineral rights? The question caught Mason off guard, but he found the answer came easily. I'll restore the ranch house. It was important to Hannah. As for the minerals, I haven't decided, but I won't allow strip mining or any extraction that would destroy the land Hannah loved. The judge nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll see you in my courtroom at 9 o'clock, Mr. Reed. After she departed, Mason finally had time for a quick shower and change of clothes. Alexander arrived as he was finishing, bringing a suit for Mason to wear to court. Judge Lawson's visit is a positive sign, the lawyer said as they prepared to leave. She rarely takes such personal interest in cases. Eleanor insisted on accompanying them to the courthouse, though she agreed to leave her shotgun behind. The question of Luna's care during the hearing was resolved when Ryan volunteered to remain at the ranch with her. I've got a good feeling about today, Ryan said as they left. Victoria overplayed her hand with that midnight raid attempt. Judge Lawson doesn't strike me as someone who appreciates legal shortcuts. The La Plata County Courthouse hummed with unusual activity when they arrived. Word of the dispute had spread through Durango's small community, drawing curious onlookers and local press. Mason spotted Victoria Stone near the courtroom entrance, deep in conversation with William Prescott and several men in expensive suits, who he guessed were Highland Resource Development executives. Sheriff Donovan approached as Mason and Alexander were reviewing their final notes. Thought you'd want to know, the sheriff said quietly. Mitchell resigned this morning. Left a letter admitting Victoria paid him to expedite the Bobcat removal and help survey the mineral deposits. Alexander's eyebrows rose. That's a significant development. Do you have a copy of the letter? Bringing it straight to Judge Lawson, Donovan confirmed. Figured she should see it before proceedings begin. Inside the courtroom, Mason was surprised to see his mother sitting in the second row. She rose when she saw him, her expression a complex mixture of concern and determination. Mom, he said, genuinely moved by her presence. You didn't have to come. Of course I did, she replied, straightening his tie with the automatic gesture of a mother who had done so countless times before. This is about our family's history, and she hesitated. I wanted to support you. The awkwardness that had characterized their phone conversation was still present, but softened now by their shared purpose. Did you bring the documents? Mason asked. She nodded, indicating a leather portfolio similar to Alexander's. Everything I could find. Your grandmother kept meticulous records. She lowered her voice, including correspondence with Hannah's grandfather about maintaining the separate mineral rights as a matter of honor between the families. Before Mason could respond, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Lawson entered, now in her formal robes, her expression composed and unreadable as she took her seat at the bench. This is a hearing to resolve ownership disputes regarding the property known as Morgan Ranch, including surface land rights, mineral extraction rights, and custodial arrangements for a partially domesticated bobcat, the judge began. Given the complexity of these interrelated issues, I'll allow each party to present their case in full before addressing specific legal questions. She nodded to Alexander. Counselor Hayes, as the petitioner, you may begin. Alexander rose, his manner confident but respectful. Your Honor, this case centers on three key facts. First, Mason Reed purchased the Morgan Ranch through legitimate channels, with a deed properly executed by a licensed real estate agent. Second, The Kavanaugh-Reed family has maintained continuous ownership of the mineral rights to this property since 1932, documented through multiple generations. Third, Hannah Morgan, the previous owner, clearly intended for Mr. Reed to inherit both the property and guardianship of the Bobcat known as Luna. He presented the evidence methodically: the original deed separation, the family wills establishing continuity of mineral rights ownership, Hannah's notarized statement, and the correspondence between the families confirming their mutual understanding about the divided ownership. Most telling, Your Honor, is Hannah Morgan's deliberate effort to preserve these documents and ensure Mr. Reed would find them. This wasn't a casual preference, but a carefully considered plan implemented by a woman who knew her time was limited. Alexander then addressed Luna's situation, presenting Hannah's original wildlife rehabilitation permits and documentation of her years caring for the bobcat. Mr. Reed has demonstrated a natural affinity with Luna, consistent with Hannah Morgan's belief that he would be an appropriate guardian. Independent wildlife experts have reviewed the situation and concluded that relocating Luna at this stage would likely cause significant trauma to the animal. He concluded by addressing Victoria's actions directly. Ms. Stone, while presenting herself as acting in the interests of conservation and animal welfare, has demonstrated a pattern of deception and self-interest throughout this matter. Her undisclosed connection to Highland Resource Development, her pressure on Hannah Morgan during her terminal illness, and her attempts to circumvent this court's orders all point to a fundamental conflict of interest that undermines her credibility as executor. When Alexander finished, William Prescott rose to present Victoria's case. His argument focused on technical legal points: the proper procedure for transferring trust property, the wildlife regulations governing bobcat possession, and challenges to the mineral rights documentation based on minor inconsistencies in the historical record. Your Honor, Prescott concluded, regardless of sentimental attachments or childhood promises, the law requires proper procedures. Ms. Stone has followed those procedures meticulously as executor of Hannah Morgan's estate. Mr. Reed, despite his personal connection to Ms. Morgan, has not. Judge Lawson listened attentively to both presentations, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but giving little indication of her leanings. When both attorneys had finished, she addressed Victoria directly. Ms. Stone, given the evidence of your professional connection to Highland Resource Development, why did you not disclose this potential conflict of interest when offering to assist Ms. Morgan with her estate planning? Victoria maintained her composed demeanor. Your Honor, my work with Highland is minimal and advisory only. It had no bearing on my personal friendship with Hannah or my desire to help her arrange her affairs properly. Yet you actively pursued control of property containing valuable mineral deposits that Highland has expressed interest in developing, the judge observed. That strikes me as a material conflict that should have been disclosed. Victoria's response was smooth but less confident. Hannah's primary concern was conservation of the natural environment. Any potential mineral development would have been conducted with strict environmental safeguards. Judge Lawson's expression remained skeptical as she turned to Mason. Mr. Reed, you've stated that you will not allow destructive extraction methods on this property if you retain the mineral rights. How do you reconcile that position with the potential economic value these minerals represent? There are responsible extraction methods, Your Honor, Mason replied. Methods that don't require destroying the surface environment. If development eventually occurs, it would be under strict conditions that preserve the land Hannah protected. The judge nodded thoughtfully before addressing both parties. I've reviewed the evidence thoroughly, including Sheriff Donovan's recent submission regarding Officer Mitchell's resignation and admission of improper conduct. Before rendering my decision, I'll hear closing statements from both counsels. Alexander emphasized the clear pattern of Hannah's intentions, the documented family history of the mineral rights, and Victoria's demonstrated bad faith actions. Prescott countered with arguments about proper legal procedures and the importance of upholding formal documentation over unsigned intentions. When both had finished, Judge Lawson sat silently for several moments, reviewing her notes. The courtroom remained hushed, the tension almost palpable as everyone awaited her ruling. This case presents several interconnected issues requiring separate consideration, she began. Regarding the mineral rights, the documentation provided by Mr. Reed and his family establishes a clear chain of ownership dating back to 1932. The correspondence between the Morgan and Kavanaugh families confirms mutual recognition of this arrangement across generations. I find that the mineral rights to the Morgan Ranch property remain the legal property of the Kavanaugh-Reed family line, with Mason Reed as the current holder. Victoria's expression tightened, but she remained outwardly composed. Regarding the property itself, the judge continued, while there are procedural questions about Walter Graves's authority to sell trust property, these are outweighed by evidence that Hannah Morgan intended for Mr. Reed to inherit the ranch. The hidden documentation, the nominal sales price, and Ms. Morgan's pattern of preparations all support this conclusion. Additionally, Ms. Stone's undisclosed conflict of interest casts significant doubt on the validity of any contrary arrangements made during Ms. Morgan's final illness. She turned a page in her notes. As for Luna, the wildlife expert's assessments indicate that the Bobcat has formed a bond with Mr. Reed and would suffer trauma if relocated. Given Hannah Morgan's clear wishes regarding Luna's care, I am granting conditional custody to Mr. Reed. The judge looked directly at Mason. However, Mr. Reed, this custody comes with specific conditions. First, you must obtain proper wildlife rehabilitation permits within 30 days. Second, you must allow quarterly inspections by independent wildlife specialists from the Colorado Wildlife Conservation Trust to ensure Luna's continued health and appropriate care. Third, should you ever decide to develop the mineral resources on the property, 10% of all proceeds must be placed in a trust fund for wildlife conservation efforts in the region, to be named the Hannah Morgan Memorial Fund. Judge Lawson looked up, her gaze moving between Mason and Victoria. Therefore, I rule as follows. Mason Reed is confirmed as the legal owner of the Morgan Ranch property. The mineral rights to said property are confirmed as belonging to Mr. Reed through his family line, with the conditions noted. Conditional guardianship of the Bobcat known as Luna is awarded to Mr. Reed, subject to the requirements outlined. Ms. Stone's authority as executor of Hannah Morgan's estate is hereby terminated due to undisclosed conflicts of interest. She paused, then added, furthermore, Highland Resource Development is prohibited from conducting any exploratory or extractive activities on the property without express written permission from Mr. Reed. Any violation of this order will result in significant penalties. Her expression softened slightly. This ruling attempts to balance the legal rights of ownership with the ethical responsibility of stewardship that both the Reed and Morgan families have historically demonstrated. With a single rap of her gavel, Judge Lawson concluded the hearing. This matter is resolved. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in muted conversation as people rose to leave. Victoria remained seated, her expression unreadable as she conferred with Prescott. Mason accepted congratulations from Alexander, his mother, and Eleanor, his feelings mixed between relief at the victory and consideration of the responsibilities that came with it. As they prepared to leave, Victoria approached, her professional mask firmly in place despite the defeat. "Congratulations, Mr. Reed," she said coolly. "You've won this round." "It's not a game, Ms. Stone," Mason replied evenly. "It's about honoring what matters, family commitments, promises kept, and the trust Hannah placed in me." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Perhaps recognition, perhaps merely calculation. "Highland will approach you with development proposals. They're prepared to be very generous for access to those minerals." "I'm sure they are, but any discussion will include strict environmental protections and preservation of the surface property." Mason met her gaze directly. "Some things are worth more than what you can dig out of the ground." Victoria studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slightly before turning away. Mason watched her leave, sensing that while this particular battle was over, Victoria Stone wasn't someone who conceded easily. She would regroup, recalculate, find another approach. But for now, at least, Hannah's legacy was secure. Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight bathed the sandstone steps in warm golden light. Mason's mother squeezed his arm gently. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly. "He always believed those mineral rights would matter someday, though I don't think he imagined anything like this." "Will you stay in Durango for a while?" Mason asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like to see the ranch again and meet Luna. Hannah was such a sweet child. I remember her following you around that summer before we moved away." The drive back to the ranch took them through valleys where the aspens were turning gold, their leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. Eleanor dozed in the back seat, exhausted from her night-long vigil, but satisfied with the outcome. Ryan was waiting on the porch when they arrived, Luna stretched out beside his chair in the autumn sunshine. The Bobcat rose immediately at Mason's approach, padding down the steps to meet him halfway across the yard. "She knew you'd won," Ryan said, smiling as Luna circled Mason's legs. "Been watching the road for the last hour." Mason crouched to greet her, running his hand along her spotted coat. "We did it, girl. This is your home for good now." His mother watched this interaction with wonder. "She really does trust you," she observed. "Hannah must have known that would happen." "Hannah knew a lot of things," Eleanor commented, settling into her familiar rocking chair, "including that some connections don't break, no matter how much time passes." Over the next few weeks, Mason began the process of restoring the ranch house. Alexander helped him file the proper wildlife permits for Luna's permanent care, while Ryan provided valuable insight into the property's history and maintenance needs. The most meaningful project, however, was the small memorial Mason created near the creek where he and Hannah had carved their initials so many years ago. He planted a young red maple beside the limestone rocks, its vibrant leaves catching the autumn light like flames. On the day the tree was planted, Mason knelt and placed a smooth stone at its base, engraved with simple words, "Hannah Morgan, she remembered." Luna watched from a few yards away, her golden eyes reflective in the fading afternoon light. That evening, as the first stars appeared above the mountains, Mason sat on the porch with Luna beside him. The Bobcat had grown increasingly comfortable with his presence, sometimes even sleeping at the foot of his bed during colder nights. The ranch was beginning to feel like home to both of them, a place of healing and new beginnings built on foundations of honor and kept promises. From the ridge came the haunting call of a great horned owl, its voice echoing across the valley. Luna's ears swiveled toward the sound, her body alert but not tense. She belonged here, in this liminal space between wild and tame, just as Mason had found his own place between his military past and civilian future. The mineral rights remained a complex question. Several companies had already approached with development proposals, but Mason was in no hurry to decide. For now, it was enough to honor Hannah's memory by protecting what she had loved: the land, the Bobcat, and the promise of a shared future she had never stopped believing in. As darkness settled over the Morgan Ranch, or the Morgan Reed Ranch as Mason had begun to think of it, he sat quietly on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Luna stretched beside his chair, her warm presence a comfort in the cooling night air. Mason reached down to run his hand along her spotted coat. The Bobcat's eyes half closed at his touch, a soft rumble of contentment vibrating from her chest. The sound was new. He'd never heard her purr before this week. The mountains stood silent around them, ancient witnesses to promises made and kept. From the ridge came the haunting call of a great horned owl, its voice echoing across the valley. Luna's ears swiveled toward the sound, her body alert but relaxed. "We're home," Mason said softly. The words meant as much for himself as for Luna. The Bobcat blinked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the porch light. Then she settled her head on her paws, the picture of hard-earned peace. Above them, the stars of Colorado wheeled in their timeless patterns. Mason closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the mountains wash over him. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together, on land that had been waiting for their return.